The door clicked shut behind her, and the lock engaged with a sound like a period at the end of a sentence. 3 German shepherds, retired military K9s, decorated and dangerous, turned their heads toward the woman, standing alone in the rehabilitation room. Every staff member pressed against the observation glass expected the nurse to freeze, expected her to back toward the wall, reach for the emergency call button, maybe cry. Dr. Raymond Kessler had counted on exactly that. What none of them expected was the moment all 3 dogs went completely still, not from aggression, but from something that looked, impossibly, like recognition. This story already has you leaning forward good. Stay with me until the very end, because the truth about Olivia Marsh is not something you'll see coming. If you're watching from your city, drop it in the comments. I want to see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, now is the time, because every part of this is going to hit harder than the last. The Hargrove Veterans Medical Center sat on the western edge of Dunmore, Pennsylvania, close enough to the old military base that on quiet mornings you could still hear the distant percussion of training exercises rolling in off the hills. The hospital had been built with federal money after the wars, expanded twice, and now served both active duty personnel, civilian patients within a 40-mile radius. It wasn't glamorous. The hallways smelled of industrial cleaner and recycled air. Cafeteria served food that looked like it had been designed by committee. Staff was good, most of them, anyway, and the work was real. Olivia Marsh arrived on a Tuesday in late October, 2 weeks after the previous charge nurse on the rehabilitation floor had taken emergency medical leave. Came with a thin personnel file, a quiet handshake, and a manner that some people immediately mistook for shyness. 34 years old, medium height, with dark circles under her eyes that never fully disappeared no matter how much sleep. She got the kind of circles that come not from laziness, but from years of running on 4-hour nights and adrenaline. Her hair was always pulled back. Her scrubs were always clean. She never once arrived late. She also never talked about herself. Not once. In the first week, her supervisor, Dr. Raymond Kessler, pegged her as manageable. He ran the rehabilitation wing the way some men ran everything, by measuring how much resistance a person offered before they bent. Olivia offered none. When he asked her to cover 2 extra shifts because a junior orderly had called out, she said yes. When he asked her to reorganize the supply closet, a task that wasn't remotely in her job description, she did it without complaint, staying 40 minutes past her shift end to finish. When he told her, in front of 3 other nurses, that her intake documentation was formatted incorrectly, even though it followed the hospital's own template to the letter, she thanked him for the feedback and said she'd adjust. She's either incredibly patient or incredibly stupid, Donna Reyes said to one of the other nurses, low enough to be private but not low enough. Her name was Priya Anand, and she had the uncomfortable awareness to feel bad about overhearing it even as she laughed. Olivia was neither. But she didn't correct anyone's assumptions. She rarely corrected anyone about anything. There were small things that people noticed and then forgot about, the way you notice something unusual about a painting and then stop thinking about it because the room is crowded and the wine is decent. The way she could assess a patient's pain level from across a room before she'd even read the chart. The way her hands never shook, even during the cases that made the third-year residents pale. The way she asked questions about the military veterans on the floor that were oddly specific. Not the kind of questions a civilian would ask. Not what was your deployment, like general curiosity, but pointed, informed. Precise questions about particular types of injuries, particular patterns of recovery. Nobody connected those dots. Nobody tried. In her second week, Dr. Kessler's discovered that pushing Olivia was not only easy but entertaining. It wasn't a cruel entertainment. He would have told you more like the satisfaction of finding a stuck drawer that slides open smoothly. She accepted everything. Redirect her from her assigned patients to clean a discharge room? Done. Ask her to transport a patient to radiology when there were 2 orderlies standing in the hallway doing nothing? She went. When the K9 Integration Program Coordinator asked if someone from the nursing staff could assist with the animal welfare documentation, a task that was administrative and had nothing to do with clinical care, Kessler volunteered Olivia, without telling her until it was already arranged. You'll be the nursing liaison for the K9 program, he told her, not as a question. They need someone to maintain medical records for the therapy animals. Simple paperwork. Okay, she said. He waited for more. The K9 integration program was newer than most of the hospital's initiatives, born from a congressional mandate to expand therapy options for veteran patients dealing with PTSD, traumatic brain injury, and the particular kind of grief that comes from leaving behind a life that required you to be a different kind of person entirely. program had been running for about 8 months, and it incorporated 4 animals, 2 younger dogs currently in active therapy rotation, and 3 who were transitioning. The 3 in transition were the reason nobody volunteered for the liaison role. Their names were Gunner, Atlas, and Dusk. Gunner was a 10-year-old German Shepherd who had spent 6 years attached to a special operations unit in 3 different countries. He had a scar along his left flank from a fragment injury and one ear that sat slightly lower than the other from an old concussive event. He was formally retired from duty, which meant technically he was supposed to be approachable, but the handlers had learned quickly that Gunner operated on his own terms. Tolerated people he decided to tolerate. He dismissed everyone else with a focus so complete it bordered on contempt. Atlas was younger, 8 years old, all black with a wide chest and eyes that processed everything in the room before you'd registered. He was looking at you. He'd been a tracker dog, which meant his brain was always several steps ahead of his body, always working through variables, always evaluating. He'd been brought to the program after his handler was killed in a training accident. He had been, according to his transfer documentation, slow to re-engage with new human relationships. Dusk was the oldest 11, a sable-colored shepherd who walked with a slight list to her right side because of an old hip injury. She was the quietest of the 3. She was also, according to every handler who had worked with her, the most observant. She could read a person in under 10 seconds. She had made 2 grown men veterans, combat-hardened, step backwards, simply by standing still and looking at them. All 3 had been placed in a large room at the end of the rehabilitation corridor that had been converted from a physical therapist space into what the program called an assessment suite, a neutral environment designed to allow gradual integration before therapy sessions began. The room had rubber flooring, low furniture, natural light from 2 wide windows, and a water station along the south wall. It smelled like dog and antiseptic and something older, harder to name. Olivia spent the first 3 days of her K9 liaison duties in the file room, reviewing medical and behavioral records. She asked the program's senior handler, a retired Army sergeant named Wade Okafor, several questions about each dog's injury history and recovery timeline. Okafor's answered them because they were good questions, the kind that came from genuine understanding rather than obligation, and because he was tired of dealing with hospital staff who treated the animals like props in a feel-good program. "You work with dogs before?" he asked her on the second day. In that way, people ask questions when they're actually trying to figure something else out. "Some," she said. He waited for more. There wasn't more. On the 4th day, Dr. Kessler found out through Okafor's weekly report to administration that the nursing liaison had not yet entered the assessment suite with the dogs. He framed this as a problem, a failure to complete assigned duties, even though the protocol specified that nursing liaisons only had to work from documentation in the first week. He called Olivia into his office and explained that she was behind. "You need to begin hands-on assessment integration," he said. "That means entering the suite and doing an initial behavioral observation." "I've been reviewing documentation," she said. "The program needs active participation from the nursing staff. Committee expects it." He was watching her the way certain people watch people they expect to disappoint them. "Can you handle that? When would you like me to start?" He smiled, but it didn't reach anything. "Tomorrow." First thing, what he didn't tell her, because the cruelty of it required her not to know in advance, was that tomorrow morning was the day all 3 dogs were being moved from their individual holding areas into the assessment suite simultaneously for the first time. It was an evaluation step the handlers had been nervous about. For weeks, 3 large, high-drive, trauma-adjacent animals in a shared space without prior socialization to each other in this setting. The handlers planned to be present during the move. Kessler made a call to Okafor that evening. He had a talent for framing manipulation as administrative clarity. By the time he was done, Okafor understood that the nursing liaison would be present for the initial assessment in the morning, and that her presence during the transition period would be a test of the program's civilian integration protocols. Okafor had reservations, but Kessler had authority, and authority moved through hospitals the way it moved everywhere downward with gravity. Olivia arrived at 6:47 the next morning, 13 minutes before her shift technically began. She changed into her scrubs, clipped her badge, and went to the assessment suite corridor without stopping for coffee, which was unusual enough that Donna Reyes, who was arriving for a handoff, noticed and told Priya Anand about it later, because small observations about Olivia Marsh had become a minor recreational habit among the nursing staff. Corridor outside the assessment suite had 3 people in it. When Olivia arrived, Okafor, a younger handler named Tess Bremer who had joined the program 6 months ago, and a man named Dr. Curtis Halloway, the administrative physician attached to the K9 program for documentation purposes. Halloway had a tablet and the posture of someone who expected things to be difficult. "Good morning," Olivia said. Okafor looked at her and then looked at the door. "You know what we're doing today?" "Moving all three into the suite together for the first time," she said. "Dr. Kessler briefed me." She could see from Okafor's expression that Kessler had not told him exactly that, but she filed it away without comment. "There's an observation window," Tess Bremer said. Her tone wasn't unkind, but it was clear. "You can watch from there. Or I can go in," Olivia said. Nobody answered immediately, which was its own answer. "These aren't therapy dogs yet," Okafor said carefully. "Still in transition. Gunnar especially is." "I know Gunnar's history," she said. Another pause. Okafor studied her. "You read the files." "I read the files," she said. She said it without emphasis, which was somehow more unnerving than if she'd said it with confidence. Kessler arrived at 7:02, coffee in hand, moving with the particular energy of someone who had arranged something and was here to watch it unfold. 2 nurses from the rehabilitation floor were with him, not because they had reason to be there, but because he'd mentioned the K9 assessment in a way that made it sound worth seeing. Word spread. By 7:15, there were 6 additional staff members at the observation window, making small talk and checking their phones and waiting, though most of them couldn't have told you exactly what they were waiting for. The dogs were brought down individually, leashed, and moved into the suite one at a time, with the handlers present. Gunnar first. He walked into the room with the controlled, assessing energy of an animal that was perpetually gathering information. Next, head high, reading everything. Dusk last, moving carefully because of her hip, but no less present, no less sharp. Okafor and Bremer brought the dogs in and then stepped back toward the door, unclipping the leashes, maintaining position. The 3 animals moved around the space, with the careful deliberateness of experts working through a new environment. They did not posture toward each other. They had been in each other's proximity before, in the holding areas, through scent and sound. This was different only in degree. Then Kessler said, "Okay, Nurse Marsh. Protocol requires your initial assessment." Okafor turned and looked at Kessler with an expression that asked a question Kessler ignored. "Go ahead," Kessler said to Olivia. "Document your behavioral observations. You'll need to enter the suite." It was the kind of instruction that was shaped to look professional and felt like something else entirely. Bremer took a small step forward and said, "We can bring her in gradually. Let the dogs." "Protocol is clear," Kessler said. Okafor said Raymond. "She volunteered for this role," Kessler said, and his voice was even pleasant, the voice of a man who had already won. "Capable. Right, Nurse Marsh?" Every face at the observation window turned. There were 8 or 9 people out there now. Someone had started recording on their phone. Olivia looked at the door. Then she looked at Kessler. "I'll go in," she said. The door opened. The suite was large enough that the sound of the lock disengaging didn't cause immediate reaction from the animals they registered it and continued processing. Gunnar moving to the east side of the room, Atlas standing at the center, Dusk positioned near the window. The light was gray and flat, the October morning not giving much away. Olivia stepped inside. The door was pulled shut behind her. The lock engaged. Through the observation glass, the staff watched in silence. Kessler had his arms crossed, coffee cooling in his hand. Bremer was pressed against the wall, closest to the door handle. Okafor was very still, watching with the focused attention of a person who has stopped performing calm and is actually feeling it. Olivia did not move toward the dogs. She stood in the entry area, weight balanced, arms at her sides not stiff, not performatively relaxed, just present. Her breathing was steady. Her eyes moved from Gunnar to Atlas to Dusk in a slow arc, reading them the way the program documentation described Dusk reading people fast, precise, thorough. Gunnar stopped moving first. He turned and looked at her directly, ears forward, head tilted by a fraction of a degree. Atlas shifted his weight. Dusk raised her head from the window. From outside, Priyanan said quietly, "Why aren't they moving?" Nobody answered her. Olivia took 2 steps forward. She stopped. She did something that none of the handlers could quite describe afterward. When they were asked, she made a sound, barely audible through the glass. Low and short, a vocalization that wasn't a word and wasn't a whistle but was somehow both. It was a sound with a shape to it, a sound that meant something specific. Gunnar's posture changed, not in the way a threat changes, not the stiffening, the weight forward shift, the hackles rising. He changed the way a person changes when they hears a voice they haven't heard in years. His head came down. His tail dropped from high alert and began slowly to move. Atlas made a sound in his chest. Dusk walked toward her. 10 years of hip problems, and she moved across that floor like she'd been waiting to. "What is happening?" Bramer said, and it wasn't a question. Okafor said nothing. He was watching the woman in the room with an expression that was recalculating everything. In the suite, all 3 German shepherds had moved to Olivia Marsh. They were not pawing at her or jumping. They were surrounding her, Gunner on her left, Atlas slightly behind on her right, Dusk at her feet in the kind of formation that is not taught to therapy animals or civilian dogs. That formation has a name in military working dog protocol. It is what a canine unit does when it returns to its medic. It is what a dog does when it has found the person it considered safe in places where safe was not guaranteed. Olivia crouched down slowly, and without hesitation, she put her hand on Gunner's scarred flank and said something to him that no one outside the room could hear. Through the observation glass, Kessler's coffee cup lowered an inch. Donnersoy said, "She knows these dogs." "That's not possible," Holloway said, but his voice had lost the certainty it needed to carry the sentence. Okafor turned away from the glass and looked at the door and then looked at his own hands for a moment. He had spent 11 years working with military working dogs. He had seen a lot of things. He had not seen this. Inside the suite, Olivia Marsh sat on the floor of the room where Dr. Raymond Kessler had sent her to fail, and the 3 animals that were supposed to terrify her were arranged around her like a perimeter, like guards, like family. Gunner had put his heavy head against her knee. Atlas had settled to her right. His whole body shifted toward her. Dusk lay across her feet, weight distributed with the ease of habit, of a behavior so old it didn't require thought. The phone recording from the observation window had been running for 4 minutes. Nobody moved to stop it. The moment the video hit the hospital's internal communication system, a fact of life at any institution, large enough to have departments that don't talk to each other, but small enough that everyone knows someone. In the department that does the questions started. Holloway pulled Okafor aside in the hallway and asked him, straight out, whether any of the 3 dogs had prior documented contact with Olivia Marsh. "Not in any file I've seen," Okafor said. "But the dogs are behaving as if I know what they're behaving as. So you have a theory?" Okafor looked at the door to the suite, where Olivia was still inside, and Bremer had gone in to sit nearby, not interfering, was present. "I have an observation," he said. "Theory requires more information." The information, as it turned out, was already in the building. It just hadn't been connected yet. Nurse Priya Anand, in the slightly guilty energy of someone looking for a distraction after witnessing something she couldn't explain, went to the staff lounge at her break and looked up Olivia Marsh in the hospital's personnel system. She wasn't looking for anything specific. She was just looking. The file was thin, in the way that certain files are thin, not because the person hasn't done much, but because what they've done has been stored somewhere else. There was a gap in Olivia's employment history. A clean, significant 6-year gap between a nursing certification she'd completed at 22 and her first listed hospital position at 28. 6 years. The kind of gap that meant something. Priya closed the personnel system and stared at the wall of the staff lounge for a moment, and then she went back to work and didn't say anything to anyone, because she was smart enough to know that some doors, when they open, don't open the way you expect. Kessler, meanwhile, was in his office. He had been in his office since approximately 20 minutes after Olivia entered the suite, and he had not gone back to the observation window. He was reviewing documentation. He was answering emails. He was doing the things that busy people do when they are avoiding the realization that they have made a mistake, and the mistake is larger than they had the capacity to measure when they made it. Phone buzzed. Text from Holloway. The dogs haven't left her side. Bremer says Gunner won't let anyone else approach without checking with Olivia first. Do you know her background? Kessler read the message. He set the phone face down on his desk. He picked up a pen and then put it down. He knew her background, or he thought he had. Name, certification, 2 previous nursing positions, 1 in a civilian hospital, 1 in an urgent care center. Unremarkable, quiet, manageable. He had not looked at what came before. That was the thing about gaps. They weren't absences. They were the other story. The one people carried underneath everything else. The one they didn't offer, and you didn't earn the right to hear just by having authority over them. The gap in Olivia Marsh's file was not emptiness. It was weight. It was compressed time, the kind that doesn't expand back out to explain itself just because someone finally thought to ask. The assessment suite door opened at 11:40. Olivia walked out with her clipboard and her documentation notes, and her scrub still clean, because she had spent 4 hours on the floor with 3 large dogs, and not one of them had knocked her over. Not even Gunner with his restless energy. Not even Atlas, who normally regarded new people with a wariness that expressed itself physically. Okafor was waiting in the corridor. "Can we talk?" he said. She looked at him for a moment. The question didn't surprise her. She had the look of someone who had been waiting for a particular conversation to begin, without knowing exactly when it would arrive. "Yes," she said. They went to the small conference room off the main hallway. Okafor closed the door. He sat across from her and he was quiet for a moment, in the way of someone who is deciding how to begin. And then he said, "Where did you serve?" It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't even quite a question. It was an acknowledgement, the way one person from a specific world signals to another, that the bridge exists, that the language exists, that he already knew enough to know what he was really asking. Olivia set her clipboard on the table. "That's a specific question," she said. "Specific reasons for asking." She looked at him. Then she looked at the door, not nervously more, in the way of someone completing a private calculation. "Navy," she said. "Attached to a special operations support element. I was a combat medic before I cross-trained into nursing." Okafor let the room be quiet for a moment. "Which unit?" She shook her head. "That's not a question I can answer." He nodded slowly. He understood about answers like that. Gunner's service record shows he was deployed with a special operations element in the 2nd and 3rd years of his active service, he said. So was Atlas. Dusk was attached to a different unit, but she served in the same operational theater. Paused. "In the same years you'd have been there." "Olivia didn't move. She recognized you," Okafor said. "All 3 of them did. Not the way a dog recognizes a scent it processed once and filed away. The way a dog recognizes someone it trusted in situations where trust was not a small thing. Dogs have long memories," she said. Her voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was not evenness, something that required effort to maintain. "Longer than people give them credit for," he agreed, "especially for the things that mattered to them." The room was quiet. Then Olivia said, "I treated them. Field conditions. There were injuries, Gunner's fragment wound. Atlas took a concussive event in a vehicle incident. Dusk's hip was," she stopped, pressed her lips together. "Spent a lot of time with those 3. More than was typical. Their handlers with the rotation was complicated that year." She said that last part carefully, meaning a great deal more than the words offered. "I was the consistent presence for a while." Okafor was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Does Kessler know any of this?" "No," she said. "Did you ever plan to tell anyone?" She picked up her clipboard. "Came here to be a nurse," she said. "That's what I am." She said it simply, and she meant it entirely, and both of those things were true, and also only part of the story. Stood up, and Okafor didn't stop her. Because he understood in the way of someone who had also carried a previous life into a professional one, and found that the previous life did not always make the current one easier, that some things get said in their own time, or not at all. What he didn't know, and what Olivia walking out into the rehabilitation corridor did not yet know either, was that Praja Anand's break-time curiosity had set something else in motion. She hadn't said anything. But she had shared the video of the 3 dogs settling around Olivia, like a returning commander with one person, a charged nurse on the 4th floor, who had shared it with someone else, who had forwarded it with a comment that asked the question directly, "Who is this nurse, and why do those dogs know her?" The video was 12 minutes long. By the time Olivia finished her shift at 3 in the afternoon, it had been viewed 412 times within the hospital's internal network. Comments were accumulating. The questions were accumulating. And somewhere in the administrative wing, on a floor that Olivia Marsh had never visited, a name she hadn't spoken aloud in 6 years, was being quietly searched. Outside the assessment suite window, the afternoon light had gone amber and flat, the October sky doing its low-gray Pennsylvania thing. Through the glass, Gunner was lying on his side near the center of the room. The window. Dusk was at the door. They were waiting. They were waiting. And the next morning, so was everyone else. The shift change at Hargrove Veterans Medical Center happened at 7, and by 6:55, the rehabilitation corridor was already carrying a different kind of energy than it had the day before the particular charge of a place where something has happened. And people are pretending they haven't already talked about it. The nurses moved through their handoff routines. The orderlies pushed carts, but eyes moved to the assessment suite door, and then moved away, and then moved back again. Because Dusk was still visible through the small wire-reinforced window in the door, still stationed near the entrance. And something about that posture, deliberate, patient, not random, made people uncomfortable in a way they couldn't easily name. Olivia arrived at 6:49, same time as always. She signed in, clipped her badge, checked the overnight notes for her assigned patients. She did not go to the assessment suite first thing. because her patients were her first obligation, and she was, whatever else she was, a nurse who understood that. But Okafor was in the corridor when she came through, leaning against the wall with a coffee he wasn't really drinking, and she read the situation accurately. "Problem?" she asked. "Kessler wants a meeting at 9, he said. "You, me, Holloway, and the program director." "About yesterday." "About yesterday," he paused. "You should know the video has been circulating." She looked at him steadily. "How far?" "Within the hospital, as far as I know. But the comments are getting specific." He said it the way people deliver information they wish they weren't delivering. Someone with a military background, I don't know who, left a comment that mentioned the operational theater. The years. They weren't naming you directly, but they were asking questions that people who weren't there would know to ask. She finished. "Yeah." She was quiet for a moment. Not panicking, not even close, but recalculating. The same expression Okafor had seen in the suite the day before, when she'd assessed the room. "Okay," she said. "That's all you've got? Okay, what would you like me to say?" He didn't have a good answer for that, so he finished the coffee he hadn't been drinking and walked away, and Olivia went to check on her patients. The 9 o'clock meeting was held in a conference room on the second floor that was used for administrative reviews and occasionally for the kind of conversations that were framed as collaborative but functioned as interrogations. The table was oval. The chairs were padded but not comfortable. Holloway had a tablet. Kessler had a legal pad and a pen, and the body language of a man who had spent the overnight hours rebuilding confidence that had been somewhat dented the day before. Program director was a woman named Barbara Stroud. She was in her late 50s, had a background in clinical psychology and veteran advocacy, and had built the K9 integration program from a half-page proposal to a functioning unit over 3 years of institutional fighting. She had no patience for politics, which was inconvenient because she worked in a hospital where politics were structural. She looked at Olivia when she walked in with the direct, evaluating gaze of someone who made decisions fast and revised them reluctantly. "Sit," Stroud said, and it wasn't rude, but it wasn't warm. They sat. Kessler arranged his legal pad. Holloway opened his tablet. Stroud said the video. "It was taken without authorization," Kessler said immediately. "I've already spoken to." "I'm not talking about the video's origin," Stroud said. "I'm talking about what's in it." She looked at Olivia. "You want to tell me what I'm watching?" "3 dogs demonstrating a behavioral response to a familiar presence," Olivia said. "A familiar presence." Stroud tilted her head. "How familiar?" "Depends on what information you have access to." It was a careful answer, and Stroud recognized it as such. "Nurse Marsh. I built this program. I have spent 3 years fighting for its existence and its resources and its staff. Those 3 animals," she paused, choosing her next words with the deliberation of someone who'd had enough conversations to know when precision mattered. "Those 3 animals have not responded to anyone like that. Not since they arrived here, not in 8 months. You want to explain to me how a nurse who has been in this building for 2 weeks produces a behavioral response that our certified handlers haven't been able to achieve in 8 months? The room was very quiet. Kessler had stopped moving his pen. Olivia looked at Stroud and made the calculation she'd been delaying since the conversation with Okafor the previous afternoon. Not a quick calculation, not a simple one, the kind that accounts for multiple outcomes and accepts that none of them are without cost. "I knew those dogs before they came to this program," she said, "from prior service." "Prior," Kessler started. "Military service," Olivia said. And she said it directly at Stroud, not at Kessler, because Stroud was the person in the room worth saying it to. "I was a Navy combat medic before I completed my nursing certification. I was attached to a special operations support element. I don't have clearance to discuss the specifics of the unit or the deployments, and I won't." She paused. "But I treated those 3 animals in the field, multiple times, for a sustained period. Gunner's fragment wound, Atlas's concussive recovery, Dusk's hip injury. I was the primary medical presence for them during the period when their assigned handlers were rotated out." The silence in the room was different now. It had weight. Holloway set his tablet down without looking at it. Kessler had gone very still in the way of someone whose internal narrative is undergoing emergency revision. Stroud said, "How long?" "About 14 months, Olivia said. "Maybe 16. The timelines blur." That's not a short-term exposure," Stroud said. Stopped. She looked at Okafor, who nodded once. She looked back at Olivia. "That's bonding." "That's what I'd call it too," Okafor said quietly, from his chair near the wall. Kessler found his voice. "Why wasn't any of this in your personnel file?" Olivia turned and looked at him with an expression that was not angry and not contemptuous, and was somehow harder than either. "Because I wasn't hired based on my military background," she said. I was hired as a nurse. My personnel file reflects my nursing qualifications. Prior service is my prior service. She kept her voice flat, not hostile. I didn't withhold anything I was required to disclose. There's nothing in my contracts here, or in my licensing paperwork, that required me to list details of classified operational work. She paused. Came here to do nursing. That's what I've been doing. It was hard to argue with that. Kessler tried to find the angle and couldn't. The legal pad in front of him was still blank. Stroud was leaning back in her chair, looking at the table, working through something. When she looked up, she looked at Olivia with an expression that was recalibrated, not apologetic, but adjusted. Program, she said. You understand what this could mean for the program? I have some ideas, Olivia said, because we've been trying to advance Gunner, Atlas, and Dusk to active therapy status for 2 months. They haven't been clearing the integration benchmarks. Not because they aren't capable, they're more than capable, but because they won't settle with new handlers in the way the protocol requires. She said the next part carefully. If there's someone already in this building, that they consider a primary attachment figure. I'm a nurse, Olivia said. Not a handler, that. But there are configurations. Stroud stopped, reconsidered. Can we talk separately after this? Yes, Olivia said. Kessler said, I'd like to be part of that conversation. Stroud looked at him with the particular patience of someone who has decided to be patient as a professional discipline. Of course, Raymond, she said, and nothing in her voice confirmed that she meant it. Conversation after the meeting that Stroud had proposed turned into something larger than a conversation, turned into a review not of Olivia's conduct, but of the K9 program's trajectory and, more pressingly, of the events of the past 24 hours as they were already taking on a shape that administrative instinct recognized as consequential. The video had reached administration. Specifically, it had reached the desk of the hospital's executive director, a man named Gordon Price, who was the kind of administrator who read every internal communication with the anxious vigilance of someone subject to unexpected consequences and was determined to understand them before they arrived. Price had watched the 12-minute video twice. He had then called Stroud. He had not called Kessler. That distinction moved through the hospital's informal network with the speed of all significant distinctions. Olivia didn't know about Price's involvement yet. She was, at 10:15 in the morning, doing her actual job standing at a patient's bedside in room 14. A 41-year-old Army veteran named Dennis Harlan, who had been admitted following a knee reconstruction and was dealing with the recovery with the particular stubbornness of a person who had spent 2 decades being told that pain was manageable, and who was now discovering that post-surgical pain was a different category of animal entirely. The scale is supposed to go to 10, he told her, but whoever designed the scale clearly never had someone go through his kneecap with a power drill. Scale is subjective, she said. She was checking his bandaging and her hands were steady and thorough. What would you say it is, honestly? Not what you think I want to hear. He looked at her. Most people didn't ask the second part. 7, he said. Closer to 8 in the morning. Okay, she said. That's useful. I'm going to talk to your attending about adjusting the morning dosage timing. She made a note. Sleeping? Couple hours. Where does it wake you up? Pain specifically or just general restlessness? He blinked, both I think. But the pain's first. Okay, she wrote something else. That's a pattern we can work with. To write. There was a quality to the way she listened that he'd noticed in the first day, a quality he associated with a specific kind of person, the kind trained to gather information fast and prioritize without making you feel triaged. He'd encountered it before, in field medics, not in hospital nurses as a rule. You were in, he said. It wasn't a question. She looked up. You don't have to confirm it, he said. It's just you listen like someone who was in. Capped her pen. I'll flag the medication timing, she said. Someone will be back to check vitals at noon. She walked out and he watched her go with the expression of a man who has correctly identified something and is choosing to leave it where it is. In the corridor, Priya Anand was waiting. She had the look of someone who had been working up to something and was running low on time to do it. Olivia. Can I walk with me, Olivia said, because she was already moving. Priya fell in beside her. I have to tell you something. Is it about the video? I'm the one who shared it, Priya said. The words came out in a compressed burst, the way confessions do when they've been held too long. I didn't. I only sent it to one person. I didn't think it would. How many people have seen it? Within the hospital? Probably most of the staff by now. And there's someone posted a screenshot to a veterans community forum outside the hospital. I don't know who, but people are commenting. She stopped walking. Olivia, they're asking about you specifically. There are people on that forum who I think some of them know who you are. Olivia stopped too. She was in the center of the rehabilitation corridor, and around her the hospital moved with its normal rhythms, carts rolling, a call light going on in room 9, someone's radio at the nursing station playing something too low to identify. She looked at Priya. Priya had the grace to look genuinely sorry. "I didn't know it would go like this," she said. I was curious." It's fine," Olivia said. It's not fine. Priya, her voice was even and not unkind. "It's done. It doesn't help to keep apologizing for it." She paused. "What forum?" "It's a working dog veteran community. Page is called. I'll send you the link." "Don't," Olivia said. "I know the one." She walked away, and Priya stood in the corridor and felt the particular helplessness of someone who has caused something and cannot uncause it. By early afternoon, the shape of the day had changed again, the way weather systems change not all at once, but through a series of small shifts that add up before you notice them. The forum Priya had mentioned was a private veteran community with about 12,000 members, most of them former handlers, medics, special operations personnel, and support staff from military working dog programs across multiple service branches. It was the kind of community that was close-knit in the way of people who share a very specific experience that the general public doesn't know much about, and it was protective of its members in the way of communities that had seen enough of their own get mishandled by systems that didn't understand them. Someone had posted the video with a question. Anyone recognize this situation? The dog's formation is MWD protocol. Who is this woman? By 2 in the afternoon, the thread had 47 replies. Most of them were people analyzing the dog's behavior, confirming the poster's reading of the formation, expressing the kind of contained astonishment that comes from recognizing something precise and unexpected in an unexpected place. Several people said variants of, "That's not a civilian with a good energy. That's someone those dogs have worked with before." 3 replies, posted by 3 different accounts at different intervals, were more specific. They didn't name her, but they described a combat medic, a Navy attachment to a special operations element, a person who had worked with military working dogs during a particular operational period. They described her the way people describe someone when they're confirming an identity without confirming it carefully, with enough detail to signal recognition, without enough to cross a line. One reply said simply, "She's real, give her space." The thread moderator pinned that comment and locked new replies. Nobody had named her, but the shape of her was there, visible to anyone who knew what they were looking at. Inside Hargrove, Kessler was in his office again. He had been in his office for most of the afternoon, which was unusual. He was normally a corridor presence, the kind of administrator who made his authority visible through motion. He had made 2 phone calls that his assistant had logged, and then not logged, which was also unusual. He had reviewed Olivia Marsh's personnel file for the 3rd time in 2 days, but this time he had pulled the prior employment records and called the references listed. The first reference, a charge nurse at a hospital in Western Virginia, described Olivia as exceptionally competent and mentioned, almost as an aside, that she had a knack for trauma cases that most nurses with her years of hospital experience didn't develop. She was always better in the hard cases, the charge nurse said. Routine slowed her down, I think. The second reference was a number that rang 4 times and then connected to a recorded message for a government office that Kessler didn't immediately recognize. He left a message. He didn't get a call back. That evening, as Kessler was leaving for the night, he passed the K9 program's handler suite and heard, through the partially open door, Okafor on a phone call. He wasn't trying to listen. But the hallway carried sound, and Okafor's voice had the distinctive quality of a man being very careful about what he said, which made the words that did carry through the door register with unusual clarity. "Not her call to make at this point," Okafor was saying. "People are asking questions from outside the hospital. There are veterans on external forums who clearly have prior contact with her." A pause. I know that. But the administration is going to press for a full background disclosure, and once that process starts, another pause longer. I'm not saying that. I'm saying she should get in front of it." Kessler kept walking. His pace was normal, his face was composed, but the back of his neck was doing something that felt, for the first time in longer than he could immediately recall, like accountability. Olivia's last patient of the day was a 63-year-old Marine Corps veteran named Howard Riley, who had been in the rehabilitation ward for 3 weeks following a stroke that had taken most of the function from his left arm. He was recovering with the kind of slow, grinding determination that rehab required, and he was not gracious about it. He was combative and impatient, and he argued with the occupational therapist twice a week and had made 2 nurses cry in his first week, not from cruelty but from a frustration that didn't know how to find any other exit. He didn't argue with Olivia. He hadn't argued with Olivia once. He couldn't explain it when his daughter asked him why, and he'd answered, "She doesn't take the bait." That evening, as Olivia was completing his end-of-day notes, he said, "There's something going on in this building." "There's always something going on in this building," she said, not looking up. "Something about you," he said. She wrote another line. "I saw something on that forum," he said. He had his tablet, and his one functioning hand had gotten good at navigating it. The MWD forum, she looked up. "I'm not on there for gossip," he said quickly. And there was something almost defensive in it, which was unusual for Howard Riley. "My nephew does K9 training. I follow the community." He held the tablet up. Screen showed the pinned comment. "She's real. Give her space." "Is that you?" She looked at it for a long moment. "You don't have to answer," he said. "But if it is." He set the tablet down. He looked at the window at the early dark outside. "They mean it. That community. When they say give someone space, it means they'll protect it. Nobody's going to post names or specifics. That's not how they operate." "I know how they operate," she said quietly. He looked back at her. His left arm lay still against the bed the way it always did, that absence of movement that he was fighting back against one therapy session at a time. "Then you know the people who left those comments know exactly who you are." "Yes, they're choosing not to say." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. He was a man who had spent 4 decades learning when to speak and when not to, and he brought that discipline to bear now. Spent 31 years being underestimated by people who looked at the rank instead of the record, he said finally. "It doesn't get easier. It just gets more familiar." Pen. She picked up the chart, she said. "Get some sleep, Howard." And she said it the way someone says something that contains more than what it contains, with enough weight in the ordinary words that he understood she had heard him. In the hallway, she leaned against the wall for 3 seconds, not from weakness, from the particular kind of tiredness that isn't physical, the kind that comes from carrying something past, the point where you expected to have put it down by now. 3 seconds. Then she straightened and walked toward the nursing station. The next morning brought something none of them had been prepared for. At 7:15, 20 minutes into the morning shift, a vehicle pulled into the hospital's main parking structure, a plain dark sedan, the kind of unremarkable government-adjacent transport that certain personnel traveled in when traveling inconspicuously was the point. 2 people got out. One was a woman in her mid-40s in civilian clothes, who walked with the posture of someone who had spent a long time in uniform. The other was a man carrying a document folio, moving with the slightly ahead-of-the-moment efficiency of a person used to institutional time. They went to the front desk, asked for the hospital's executive director. Gordon Price's assistant called Price at 7:18. Price arrived at the front lobby at 7:22. The woman introduced herself. Her name was Commander Elise Farrow. She was attached to a Navy personnel office, and she was here in a liaison capacity regarding a current hospital employee. She used the word liaison, the way certain people use polite words precisely, with full awareness of how much the precision is doing. Price, who had been an executive director for 11 years and had developed a finely tuned sensitivity to the gravitational mass of conversations, said, "I see. Can I ask the nature of the inquiry?" "It's not an inquiry," Commander Farrow said pleasantly. "More of a courtesy notification." She handed him a document. He read the first paragraph. He read it again. He said, "I wasn't aware of." "Most people in her current professional environment aren't," Farrow said. "It's intentional. I'd like to speak with her, with your permission. And I'd like to speak with whoever is responsible for the K9 integration program." Price said yes to both without hesitation, because the document in his hand made other responses seem inadvisable. Called Stroud first. Then, because administrative instinct required it, he called Kessler. Kessler answered on the second ring and listened and said nothing for a full 4 seconds after Price stopped talking. "Who are they?" Kessler asked. "Navy personnel," Price said. "Liaison capacity." Another silence. "What does that mean?" "It means we should all be in my conference room at 8, Price said. And his voice had acquired a quality. It didn't normally have the quality of a man who has just understood that the situation he thought he was managing was actually managing him. Olivia was in room 14, checking on Dennis Harlan's knee when Stroud found her. Stroud opened the door, looked at Olivia, and said simply, "When you're finished." Harlan, who was not a person without perceptive capacity, looked between the 2 women and then looked at his knee. "Go," he said. "I'll still be here." Olivia followed Stroud into the corridor, and Stroud began walking toward the elevator. "There are people from a Navy personnel office here," Stroud said, keeping her voice low and level. "They're upstairs in Price's conference room. They ask specifically for you." Olivia's step didn't change. "When did they arrive?" 20 minutes ago. Who knows they're here? Price me. Kessler. Stroud paused. The front desk staff, obviously. It'll be moving through the building already. She glanced sideways at Olivia. Do you know why they're here? I have a reasonable theory, Olivia said. Would you like to share it? After I've spoken to them. They reached the elevator. Stroud pressed the button, and they stood waiting, and Stroud said, in a voice that was not performing casualness, because she wasn't that kind of person. Program Director of a Navy MWD Personnel Liaison Office doesn't show up to a civilian hospital as a courtesy without a reason. No, Olivia agreed, she doesn't. The elevator opened. Stepped in. The doors closed. Stroud looked at the floor display. Whatever is in that room upstairs, Olivia, whatever they came here to say, I want you to know that as far as the K9 program is concerned, what I saw in that video is what matters to me, not your history or your file or how long you were deployed. Those 3 dogs were suffering in a way I didn't have the tools to fix, and you walked in there and fixed it in 4 hours. She paused. I just wanted to say that before we walk into whatever this is. Olivia looked at her. For the first time since she had arrived at Hargrove Veterans Medical Center, something moved across her face that was not composure, a brief, unguarded thing, there, and then controlled. But real. Thank you, she said. Her voice was steady, but only because she made it steady. The elevator reached the 4th floor. The doors opened. Down the hall, through the glass wall of the executive conference room, Kessler was visible, already seated, already diminished in his posture in a way that was new, a man inside a situation that had outgrown his understanding of it. Commander Farrow stood at the head of the table, and she was reviewing something in the document folio. She looked up as Olivia and Stroud came down the hallway, and she looked directly at Olivia with the specific recognition of someone who has been briefed on a person and is now confirming the briefing was accurate. Olivia stopped walking, not because she was afraid, because in the glass, reflected against the gray 4th floor light, she could see Kessler looking at her through the window, seeing her the way he had never once bothered to look before, with the dawning and uncomfortable awareness of a man who had assigned tasks to someone he had never actually seen, and beside him, visible over his shoulder, was the document folio open on the table. The top page turned outward. She was too far away to read the text, but she could see the seal at the top of the page. She had last seen that seal 6 years ago on the last day of her service, when they had processed her out and she had signed the forms and turned in her badge and walked out into a morning that smelled like diesel and grass and the specific kind of quiet that follows from a long time of noise. Commander Farrow said something to the man beside her, turned and opened the conference room door. Nurse Marsh, Commander Farrow said, and her voice carried cleanly down the hallway. Please come in. Kessler's expression, caught in the glass reflection, and then in the real as Olivia moved past the window. That expression was the specific expression of a man beginning to understand, in full and undefended clarity, exactly how wrong he had been, and how long he had been wrong, and what that wrongness had cost someone who deserved better than all of it. Olivia walked into the conference room, and the door closed behind her, and what happened in that room in the next 37 minutes would reach every floor of Hargrove Veterans Medical Center before the morning was done. What happened in that room in the next 37 minutes would reach every floor of Hargrove Veterans Medical Center before the morning was done, but it did not reach every floor the way rumors reach, fragmented, distorted, growing louder and less accurate with each retelling. It reached them the way certain truths reach places quietly, with weight, settling into the building's awareness, the way cold settles into a structure at night, through every gap and seam, changing the temperature of everything it touched. Commander Elise Farrow did not waste the first 5 minutes on pleasantries. She introduced her associate, a lieutenant commander named Paul Geddes, who was there for documentation purposes and who had the practiced stillness of someone trained to be a credible witness, and then she placed 2 items on the table. The first was the open document folio, its pages organized with the precision of a file assembled for a specific purpose. The second was a smaller folder, gray, with a classification marking on the cover that made Kessler's eyes stop moving over it, and then moved carefully away. Stroud was watching Olivia. Price was watching Farrow. Kessler was trying to watch everything and succeeding at nothing. Farrow said, Nurse Marsh, I want to be straightforward with you about why we're here. She kept her voice even, professional, without the performative warmth that some people used as a replacement for directness. The video of your interaction with the K9 unit reached a veteran community forum. You already know that. What you may not know is that 3 individuals who were part of specific operational teams during your service period made contact with our office within 18 hours of the video's posting. Olivia said nothing. They weren't filing complaints, Farrow said. They were asking us to make sure you were okay. The room adjusted to that sentence in different ways. Price blinked. Stroud's expression shifted by a fraction. Kessler looked at his hands. Olivia was very still. They were concerned that your professional cover, in terms of keeping your service history private, had been compromised by the video, Farrow continued, and they wanted the Navy to be aware of the situation before it developed further. She paused. Why we're here. Not to discipline you, not to compel disclosure. To make sure you have the support of your branch, and to give you the option to control your own narrative going forward. Olivia looked at the gray folder. That's your commendation file, Farrow said, following her gaze. I brought it because some of the people in this room may need context. With your permission, I can share it. Olivia's jaw tightened slightly. A small movement, the kind that comes from the collision between private and public. Then she said, yes, go ahead. Farrow opened the gray folder and placed 3 pages on the table facing Price and Stroud. She did not place them facing Kessler, and that was not an accident. Price read the top page. He read it the way people read things that exceed their expectations slowly, going back to check that the words actually say what he thought they said. Stroud read it faster, with the focused economy of someone trained to extract critical information quickly, and when she finished, she looked up at Olivia with an expression she didn't fully control in time. The first page listed Olivia's service record in the framework available without full classified detail. 5 years and 8 months of active service, Navy, Medical Corps, attached to Special Operations support in 3 operational theaters. 2 commendations for valor under fire. 1 Navy Achievement Medal with Combat Distinguishing Device. 1 citation, the specifics partially redacted, for medical actions during a critical incident in which she had sustained an injury herself and continued providing care. You were wounded, Stroud said. Shrapnel, Olivia said. And she said it the way someone says a word they've said so many times it's become plain. Shoulder. It wasn't significant. It was significant enough to be cited, Farrow said. Kept working, Olivia said. That's not special. The job. Kessler made a sound that was not quite a word. Everyone looked at him. He pressed his mouth closed. Farrow moved to the second page. The K9 section, she said. And this one she placed so that Okafor could read it too, because he had arrived at the conference room door during the first 5 minutes and Price had waved him in, because everyone understood instinctively that his presence was appropriate. During a 14-month period during your 3rd and 4th years of service, you were the primary medical support for a military working dog unit attached to your element. 3 animals designated G7, A4, and D2 in the operational records. She looked up briefly. Atlas and Dusk in their current designations. Okafor put his hand over his mouth and looked at the ceiling for a moment. During this period, Farrow continued, you provided emergency veterinary first aid, sustained recovery care, behavioral monitoring, and according to the written account of the unit's supervising handler, submitted as part of a commendation recommendation, you maintained those animals through a period when their assigned handlers were medically unavailable, keeping them operationally functional and psychologically stable. She set the page down. The handler's account specifically states that, without your intervention, at least 1 of the 3 animals would have been lost. The room was completely silent. Which one? Okafor asked, and his voice was rough at the edges. Farrow looked at Olivia. Olivia looked at her own hands, flat on the table in front of her. Gunner, she said. He took the worst of the fragment event. His handler was already down. The secondary handler was managing another situation, and she stopped. He was going into shock. I had limited supplies and an active perimeter, and I sat on the floor of a position that was not secure, and I kept him alive for 6 hours until we could get medical extraction. The room absorbed that. Kessler had stopped looking at anything in particular. His legal pad was closed. His pen was on top of it. He had the look of a man in the process of being fundamentally rearranged. Farrow gathered the pages. Nurse Marsh. The Navy's position is this. Your choice to maintain a private professional profile after your service is entirely within your rights, and nothing that has happened here obligates you to disclose anything further than you choose to disclose. She paused. However, given that the situation has developed to the point where external parties are inquiring, we wanted to give you the option to make a formal statement through proper channels, which would allow you to control what is said and what isn't. I'll think about it, Olivia said. That's all we're asking. Farrow stood, and Geddes stood with her. She looked around the table. I'd ask that the contents of this meeting remain in this room until Nurse Marsh decides how she'd like that to proceed. She looked last at Kessler, and her gaze on him was brief and level, and said nothing that she would have been wrong to say out loud. Thank you for your time. She and Geddes left. The room was quiet for a long moment after the door closed. Then Price said, "Olivia, I need to get back to my patients," she said. Stood, and she walked out, and nobody stopped her, because nobody had the language yet for what the room had just become. She made it to the stairwell at the end of the fourth-floor hallway before she stopped moving. Not to cry, she wasn't going to cry, not here, not in the building, but because her body required a moment that her mind had been refusing to give it. She stood in the gray concrete space between the third and fourth floor landings, hand against the cold wall, and she breathed. Her left shoulder ached the way it always ached in cold weather, the way it had ached every October since the incident, and she pressed her palm against it, briefly, an unconscious gesture, the body's small private notation. 6 years. She had rebuilt herself methodically. Nursing school, clinical hours, 2 hospital positions, this one. Each step deliberate, each step adding distance from the person she'd been in. Places where the stakes had been absolute and the margin for error had been 0. She hadn't been running away from that person. She understood herself well enough to know that. She had been carrying her carefully, the way you carry something fragile into a new environment, protecting it from damage while you figured out where it fit. She'd thought she had more time before someone looked directly at it. She was wrong. And being wrong in that particular way, not in a medical decision, not in a procedural judgment, but in the estimation of how long she could carry 2 lives in one body, was the kind of wrong that sat differently. Straightened, she went back through the stairwell door and down the hall to the rehabilitation floor. She had 4 patients who needed checking. Howard Riley's PT session was at 11. Dennis Harlan's wound care was due at 12:30. She was behind, not catastrophically, but behind. She went back to work. The meeting's contents were supposed to stay in the conference room. They did not stay in the conference room because they never do not, because the people who agreed to contain them were dishonest, but because hospitals are breathing organisms and information moves through them the way oxygen moves through anything alive. By 10:30, the broad strokes were loose in the building. The Navy had sent people. Service record was not what anyone had imagined. The dogs were not a coincidence. The version that reached Donna Reyes at the nursing station was incomplete but accurate in its emotional core. She was a decorated combat medic. She treated those dogs in the field. Kessler sent her in there on purpose. The version that reached the orderly break room was less precise, but directionally correct. She did something important over there. Navy showed up this morning. Kessler's been in his office since. The version that reached Howard Riley in room 14 came through his daughter, who had gotten it from a nurse aide in the hallway, who had gotten it from Priya Anand, who had spent the morning walking around with the particular guilt weight of someone whose small action had detonated something much larger than she'd intended. Riley's daughter, whose name was Sandra, and who had driven from throughout twice a week for 3 weeks to sit with her father during his recovery, read the message on her phone and then looked at her father and said, "Dad." "That nurse Marsh. I knew she was in," he said. "She has 2 commendations for valor." He was quiet. Outside the window, the Pennsylvania October was doing its flat gray business, the trees along the hospital perimeter stripped down to structure. "That explains the shoulder," he said. "What shoulder?" "She favors her left," he said, barely. "Most people wouldn't see it." Sandra looked at him, and then at the door, and then back at him. "I'm glad she's your nurse," she said. "So am I," he said. At 11:40, the thing that broke the day open happened in the rehabilitation gym. The gym occupied a large space on the rehab floor's eastern end: treadmills, parallel bars, exercise tables, a padded floor section for mobility work. It was staffed by 2 physical therapists and normally supervised by the floor charge nurse, who rotated. At 11:40, the charge nurse had stepped out to manage a call light situation in the hallway. 2 PTs were working with separate patients. There were 4 people in the gym, 2 PTs, 2 patients. Then there were complications. The first patient was a 28-year-old veteran named Marcus Webb, 3 weeks post-spinal surgery, working on controlled movement exercises. The second was a 67-year-old civilian patient named Ruth Pullman, who had been transferred from orthopedics and was doing post-hip replacement mobility work near the parallel bars. Ruth Pullman lost her footing. It happened in the way these things always happen: fast, then slow, then very loud in the aftermath. Her left foot caught on the floor mat's edge, and her weight shifted wrong and she went sideways with the particular violence of a person whose new hardware is not yet trusted by the body that contains it. Her PT, a young woman named Cara Diaz, was 4 feet away and moving before the sound finished, but not close enough. Ruth hit the parallel bars on the way down shoulder first, then head. A glancing contact with the bar's edge and landed on her left side on the padded floor, with enough force to produce a sound that stopped everyone in the room. The second PT hit the emergency call button. Cara Diaz was on the floor beside Ruth before the button finished beeping, running a quick assessment. Ruth was conscious. That was the first, most critical data point. She was conscious and responding, but her left arm was wrong. The shoulder presenting at an angle that Cara recognized immediately as a dislocation, and she was gripping the back of her head with her right hand, which meant the contact with the bar had been harder than a glance. Cara, said Ruth, can you tell me where you are? What's today? Ruth said something that was 3/4 of a sentence, stopped in the middle of it and made a face. Ruth, stay with me. The call went out. 2 nurses responded from the corridor, but both were junior staff, one a recent hire with less than 8 months of experience, one a second-year nurse who had never managed a fall with suspected head contact and a dislocated shoulder presenting simultaneously, stood in the gym doorway for half a second too long. Olivia was coming down the corridor from room 12 when the call registered. She didn't run, because running in a hospital creates panic in the patients who see it, but she moved at the exact edge of a run that controlled. Purposeful acceleration of someone who has responded to calls in worse conditions than this, and she was in the gym in 22 seconds. She assessed the room in a single pass. Ruth on the floor, Cara Diaz maintaining position, the shoulder presentation, the head contact. Marcus Webb frozen on his exercise table, smart enough not to move. 2 junior nurses in the doorway. 1 PT standing near the second patient, uncertain. Cara, Olivia said, moving to the floor. Talk to me. Fall from standing, shoulder first contact with the bar. Head contact secondary, glancing but definite. She's oriented, but I got a blank moment about 45 seconds ago. Lasted maybe 4 seconds. GCS? 14, I think. She's dropping words. A GCS of 14 with a 4-second gap after head impact was not a drill scenario. Olivia was already taking Ruth's right hand. Ruth. Squeeze my hand, Ruth squeezed. The grip was present, but asymmetrical. Her left side wasn't participating, which was the shoulder, probably, but possibly also early neural. Who's calling the attending? Olivia said, without looking up. One of the junior nurses said, I'll call Dr. Ashby in neurology and whoever's covering orthopedics now. Not the floor attending. Neurology first. The junior nurse moved. Second call, not a page, phone call. She looked at the shoulder. Classic anterior dislocation. The head of the humerus had come forward out of the glenoid socket, the shoulder presenting in that characteristic flattened, displaced shape. Fresh, meaning the surrounding musculature hadn't seized yet, meaning the window for reduction was open. But the head contact changed the calculation entirely. You did not attempt shoulder reduction on a patient with suspected intracranial involvement without a neurological clearance, because the pain response and the Valsalva could raise intracranial pressure, and if there was bleeding behind the bone, you could take a managed situation to a catastrophic one in under a minute. She did not attempt reduction. We need a backboard and a C-collar as a precaution, she told the remaining PT. Room's got a supply cart on the east wall, go. She stayed with Ruth's hand and looked at Ruth's eyes, watching for the pupil response, watching the track of her gaze. Ruth, I'm Olivia. I'm a nurse. You fell and we're taking care of you. Can you tell me if your head hurts? Yes, Ruth said. The yes, on a scale of 1 to 10, 6, 7, a pause. It was worse. It was worse immediately after, I think. Yes, Olivia filed that. A spike that was now reducing was better than a spike that was building. Better not resolved. Your left shoulder hurts too. I know, Ruth said. I'm not touching it. Promise. She looked at Cara, keep her still. I want her head movement minimal until the C-collar's on. Got it. Dr. Ashby arrived in 4 minutes, which was fast. The orthopedic resident came 90 seconds later. The sequence of decisions that followed was clean and collaborative. Ashby doing a rapid neurological assessment, talking through his findings in the shorthand of someone who'd been doing this long enough that he didn't need to perform competence. Olivia providing the timeline, Cara providing the mechanism, the resident palpating the shoulder with the careful efficiency of someone who knew when not to rush. Decision was a CT first, shoulder after. The right call. As they were preparing for transport, Dr. Ashby looked at Olivia and said, You were first on scene? Yes. Good call on the C-collar. And not attempting reduction, that was the right read. Thank you, she said, and she meant it straightforwardly, without false modesty. Ruth was stabilized and moved to imaging. The gym cleared slowly. Residents, the 2 PTs, an additional nurse who had arrived during the response. Olivia stayed to complete the incident documentation, which was required and which she did thoroughly, with the careful language of someone who understood that incident reports were legal documents as much as clinical ones. She was writing the last section when she heard footsteps behind her and turned. Kessler was in the gym doorway. She had not spoken directly to him since the conference room. He looked like a man who had been having an internal argument since approximately 9 in the morning and had not yet resolved it. He also looked smaller than he normally looked, not physically, but in the way that a person looks smaller when the posture they've been holding for years suddenly costs too much to maintain. "I heard what happened," he said. She turned back to the documentation. It was a manageable incident. "The patient is in imaging." He said, "You prevented a complication." Ashby prevented a complication, provided information. Kessler took 2 steps into the gym. He stopped. He looked at his own hands for a moment, which was a gesture she'd seen him make once before in the observation window the first morning, when the dogs had done the impossible thing, and he hadn't known how to stand in relation to it. "Olivia," he said, "I owe you an apology." She kept writing. "What I did sending you into that suite without proper preparation, without telling you what the morning's protocol was." He stopped. "It was wrong. I want to say that directly." She finished the line she was writing, capped her pen. She turned and looked at him with the expression of a person who has been deciding, not in the moment but over several days, how to handle exactly this. "Yes," she said. It was. He had apparently expected more resistance, because the simple agreement seemed to take him off balance. "Dr. Kessler," her voice was even. "You assigned me tasks below my clinical level because I didn't push back. You put me in a situation you intended to be embarrassing, because I didn't give you a reason to think I could handle it." She paused. "That's a pattern, not a single incident. I accept that you're sorry, but I think you should also look at that pattern." He was very still. "Because I'm not the only person you manage," she said, picked up the incident report and walked out of the gym. Kessler stood in the empty space and let the echo of that settle around him, because some things need to be said plainly and then left to do their work. Ruth Pullman's CT came back at 1:47. No intracranial bleed. No fracture. A mild concussion, the gap in orientation consistent with a brief concussive event, the headache consistent with the contact mechanism. The shoulder reduction was performed under sedation at 2:15 by the orthopedic resident with the attending present. Procedure was clean. Ruth was moved to observation. By 3 in the afternoon, the rehabilitation floor had returned to its operational rhythm, the particular, resuming cadence of a place where emergencies happen, and then life continues because it has to. Olivia was at the nursing station completing the last of her afternoon documentation when Okafor appeared. He didn't say anything immediately. He leaned against the counter and watched the corridor for a moment, a man gathering his words the careful way. "Program director in D.C. called Stroud," he said finally. Olivia looked up. Apparently Commander Farrow's office flagged the situation formally. "The program director is interested." He chose the word with care. "In whether Hargrove's K9 program has the capacity to serve as a model site for veteran rehabilitation integration, which would mean additional funding, additional staffing, external review visits." He paused. "It would also mean a formal role for you if you wanted it. Not a handler position, a medical integration specialist. Civilian nursing track, but with K9 protocol clearance." She looked at him for a long moment. "That's fast," she said. "That's what happens when Navy personnel show up to a civilian hospital," he said. "Things that took years to arrange suddenly take hours. I haven't decided anything." "I know, Stroud knows. She wanted you to have the information." He straightened, preparing to leave. "One more thing. Gunner's been off his food since yesterday." She blinked. "What?" "Not dramatically. He's eating, just leaving the last third of each meal. Bremer's not worried clinically, but she said he keeps going to the door of the suite." He looked at her sideways. "Dusk, too, they're waiting." Olivia looked at the nursing station clock. 40 minutes left in her shift. She looked at the stack of documentation she still had to complete. She looked at Okafor. "Tell Bremer I'll come by before I leave," she said. He nodded and walked away, and she turned back to the paperwork. But something had shifted in the atmosphere of the afternoon, a pressure change, the way the air changes before weather. She could feel the shape of what was coming without being able to name it precisely. There were too many moving parts, too many people who now held pieces of her history, and pieces, once distributed, did not reassemble into the shape you'd originally constructed. She knew that. She'd known it since the morning in the stairwell, pressing her palm to her shoulder. She was still writing when the elevator at the end of the corridor opened, and 2 people stepped out, a man and a woman, both in civilian clothes, both with that specific quality of posture that she recognized the way you recognize a language before you identify which one it is. They were not Commander Farrow's people. They were not hospital administration. They had visitor badges clipped at chest level, and they were looking at the nursing station with the purposeful navigation of people who knew exactly who they were looking for. The man was maybe 55, broad through the shoulders, with close-cut gray hair and a scar, as long as right jaw, that had been there long enough to be landscape. The woman's was younger, mid-40s, moving with the slight lisp to her right that Olivia knew came from an old hip injury that had healed at an angle. Olivia's pen stopped moving. She knew them. She hadn't seen either of them in 6 years, and she'd told herself in the way you tell yourself things that make the present manageable that she might never see them again. That the people from that part of her life were filed away in the part of her history that didn't intersect with the present one. But the body doesn't file things the way the mind does, and her body recognized them with an immediacy that bypassed every rational distance she'd constructed in 6 years. The man saw her first. He stopped walking. Something moved across his face, not surprise, because he'd come here knowing she was here. So it wasn't surprise, but something older and more complicated than surprise. Thing people feel when a long open question finally resolves. He said her name. Not Nurse Marsh. Not Olivia. The name she'd had before the call sign, the one that had been hers in the element, the one nobody in this building had ever heard. Stood up from behind the nursing station. Her chair scraped back. Around her, the rehabilitation floor continued its afternoon business. Nurses passing. A cart rolling. Someone's monitor beeping 2 rooms down. Normal hospital noise. The texture of the life she had built here, all of it continuing without pause. The woman beside the man put her hand over her mouth. Olivia walked around the nursing station desk. She had no script for this. She had prepared for many things in the last 48 hours: the meeting, the disclosure, the apology she'd had to navigate from Kessler, the information about the program director's interest, the documentation, the fall response, all of it. She had not prepared for this. For them. For the particular weight of 2 people who had known her when she was a completely different version of herself, standing in the hallway of the life she'd built to be quieter and safer and more controlled, looking at her with the undefended recognition of people who had carried her name for 6 years in the part of their memory reserved for people they needed to know were okay. Stopped 6 feet away from them, the man said, "We saw the video." His voice was rough. "Come." And that was when the intercom above the nursing station crackled to life, and the voice of the floor charge nurse said, "Code Blue, Assessment Suite. Code Blue, Assessment Suite. All available." Olivia was already running. Olivia was already running before the intercom finished its second repetition, moving down the rehabilitation corridor the way she'd moved through worse corridors in worse conditions, not fast enough to generate panic in the patient she passed. Fast enough that anyone watching understood this was not a routine response. The 2 visitors stood behind her in the hallway, the man with the scarred jaw and the woman with the compromised hip, and they watched her go with the particular expression of people who have just been reminded of something they already knew. The assessment suite was 40 meters from the nursing station. Covered it in 12 seconds. Bremer was already inside. She had her phone in one hand and was crouched near the south wall, and when Olivia came through the door she registered Bremer's posture controlled, professional, running on 3 seconds of panic that she'd mostly suppressed, and then she registered what was on the floor. Gunner. He was on his side. Breathing, which was the first and most important data point, but his breathing was labored, the chest moving too fast, the exhale slightly prolonged, quality of the sound wrong in the way that respiratory distress in animals has a sound that is distinct from normal respiration once you've heard it enough times to have it filed. His eyes were open, he was tracking the room, but he was not getting up, and Gunner was not a dog who stayed on the floor. Atlas was in the corner, pressed against the wall, not aggressive, contained, watching. Dusk was beside Gunner, lying against his flank, her heavy weight pressed to him in the way dogs press to each other when one of them is wrong, the oldest kind of comfort, the one that predates everything else. What happened? Olivia was already moving to him. He went down fast, Bremer said, and her voice was tight. I was doing the afternoon check, he was pacing, and then his back legs went and he went over. She was pulling up something on her phone, called the vet on call for the program. She's 20 minutes out, she said. What did she say? Possible cardiac event or neurological. Given his age and the fragment history, she said, don't move him unless he's seizing. Olivia was on the floor. She had her fingers at Gunner's neck, reading the pulse the way she'd read it 100 times in a room that smelled like desert and engine exhaust, and something she'd never had a name for. The rate was elevated. The rhythm was irregular, not catastrophically, not the life-ending arrhythmia, but irregular the way a heart is irregular when it is working too hard for reasons that haven't declared themselves yet. Has he eaten today? She asked. Half his morning meal. Why I came to check. Bremer pressed her lips together. I should have called sooner. You called when you had a reason to call, Olivia said. Not dismissive accurate, the kind of correction that was also a mercy. What's his medication history this week? He's on a joint supplement and a low-dose anti-inflammatory for the fragment site. No changes. Bremer checked her phone. Wait. The anti-inflammatory was switched 2 days ago. Different compound, same class. Dr. Voss, the consulting vet, approved it. Olivia looked at Gunner's face. He was looking at her. Focus, that specific, absolute focus, was unchanged from the morning in the suite and unchanged from 6 years before that in a room much less safe than this one. He found her and he stayed with her, and she let him, because sometimes that was the clinical intervention, and sometimes it was something else, and sometimes it was both. Can you get me Gunner's full medication file? She said. Everything in the last 2 weeks, not just the current list. The vet's going to need it when she arrives. Bremer moved to the file cabinet on the north wall. Olivia stayed on the floor. She ran through what she had. Elevated heart rate, irregular rhythm, labored breathing, acute onset, preceded by reduced appetite over 2 days, preceded by behavioral change, the pacing, the door watching, the food aversion. That sequence told a story. She wasn't a veterinarian, and she was not going to practice outside her scope. But she was someone who had managed these 3 animals in conditions, without veterinary support, someone who had learned to read them the way you learn to read anything when the stakes are high enough, and the resources are limited enough, and the alternative is unacceptable. Thought about the anti-inflammatory switch. Different compound. Same class. Same class didn't mean same metabolic pathway. In a dog Gunner's age, with his specific injury history and the low-grade systemic stress that came from years of operational service, a change in anti-inflammatory compound could produce cardiovascular effects that wouldn't appear on a standard tolerance screen. It was a hypothesis. She was not going to act on it without the vet, but she was going to have the information ready when the vet arrived. Bremer, she said. In the file, look for anything that says GI symptoms in the last 2 days. Vomiting, loose stool, anything. Bremer found the page. 2 notations, yesterday and the day before. The handler who did the morning check both days noted loose stool, logged it as possible dietary sensitivity, and nobody flagged it to the vet. A silence. No, Bremer said, and she said it with the sound of someone absorbing some that is going to cost them sleep. Okay, Olivia said, not your fault, but when Dr. Voss gets here, that's the first thing she needs to know. GI symptoms preceding cardiac presentation, preceded by a compound switch. You think it's the medication? I think it's worth ruling out. She looked at Gunner. Stable right now. Uncomfortable but stable. The room quiet. Don't try to move him unless he seizes or the breathing gets worse. Paused. Keep Atlas and Dusk close to him. Don't separate them. Bremer looked at her. That's not standard protocol. No, Olivia agreed. But it'll help him stay calm. And calm is what we need right now. She looked at Dusk, still pressed to Gunner's flank. She knows what she's doing. She stood. She looked at Gunner one more time, that still, specific look of someone making a private accounting, and then she walked out of the suite to meet the 2 people who had been standing in the hallway of her rebuilt life, waiting. They were where she'd left them, which meant they'd been patient enough not to follow her into the medical response. And patience of that kind, the restraint of people who understood when to hold position, was characteristic. The man's name was Dale Ferris, and 6 years ago he had been the senior handler of the K9 unit she'd been attached to. The woman was Renee Solis, who had been the Element's logistics specialist and who had also, at various points, been the closest thing Olivia had to a friend in a context where friendship was a complicated and abbreviated thing. Is he okay? Dale asked. He meant Gunner. Of course he meant Gunner. That's on the way, Olivia said. I think it's manageable. Renee said, what's wrong with him? Possible adverse response to a medication change. I won't know more until Dr. Voss gets here. Dale nodded. Scar along his jaw moved when his jaw tightened. He was the kind of man who carried his feelings in his jaw and his hands, and both were giving things away he wasn't saying out loud. We should have come sooner, he said. When he was transferred to this program, we should have... Couldn't, Olivia said. The transfer protocol doesn't allow handler involvement in the receiving institution's assessment period. You know that. I know that, he said. Doesn't mean I feel good about it. Renee put her hand briefly on Dale's arm, the gesture of someone who has spent years translating him to people who didn't know his language yet. Then she looked at Olivia with the directness that Olivia had always liked about her Renee. Solis had never once talked around the things she meant. We're not just here for Gunner, she said. We're here for you. I know. The video I know, Olivia said again. I'm working through it, the form Renee. She said it quietly, not harshly. Appreciate that people are protecting it. I do. But I also need to be able to manage what happens here on my own terms. She paused, still figuring out what that looks like. Renee studied her. You always manage things on your own terms. I'm rustier at it now, Olivia said, and that admission, brief and unguarded and rueful, made Renee's expression soften in a way that was more honest than any other response could have been. They were still standing in the corridor when Okafor appeared from the direction of the elevator, followed closely by Barbara Stroud, followed at a distance that was close enough to be present, but not close enough to be presumptuous by Gordon Price. Price had the look of a man who was several hours into a day he had not prepared for and was making the best of it. Stroud had the look of a woman who processed the unexpected by moving toward it rather than away. She looked at Dale and Renee, then at Olivia. Are these, Olivia said, Dale Ferris and Renee Solis. They worked with Gunner Atlas and Dusk. She paused. And with me. Stroud looked at Dale for a moment. He looked back at her with the direct, measuring gaze of a former handler who was assessing whether the person in front of him was worth trusting. Whatever he saw, he extended his hand. Stroud shook it. Your program saved those dogs, Dale said. We were worried about their placement. He said it plainly as a fact, without warmth or cold. We're less worried now. I hope we'll be less worried still, Stroud said, once I figure out what I'm doing. Something in Dale's expression adjusted, not a smile, but its precursor. That's an honest answer, he said. At 4:17, Dr. Voss arrived. She was a compact, fast-moving veterinarian in her early 40s who had been the K9 program's consulting vet since its inception and who had the professional bluntness of someone who dealt primarily with patients who could not tell her what hurt and had, therefore, developed an almost adversarial relationship with vague information. She was in the suite for 11 minutes. She emerged with Gunner's file and looked at Olivia, who had waited in the corridor, and said, You called the medication change. I flagged it as a possibility. It's not a possibility, it's the cause. She held up the file. The new compound has a known interaction profile with the fragment site scar tissue inflammation. It's rare. It requires a specific pre-existing inflammatory pattern. Gunner's got it, and nobody screened for it before the switch. She closed the file. Not the prescribing vet's fault. It's a rare enough interaction that it's not on the standard screen. But it's documented in the specialty literature. What's the treatment? We discontinue the new compound, support the cardiac symptoms symptomatically, and monitor for 48 hours. His heart's structurally fine. This is a metabolic cascade, not a primary cardiac event. He'll recover. She looked at Olivia with the appraising gaze of a professional confirming a colleague's competence. The GI symptoms were the early warning. If someone had caught them and flagged the medication change at that point, we'd have caught this before the acute presentation. I know, Olivia said. The documentation protocol for behavioral and GI changes in the K9 unit needs to be revised. The handlers are logging those symptoms, but they're not moving through a clinical review pathway. Program administration problem, Dr. Voss said, looking at Stroud, who was standing within earshot and who looked like a person adding an item to a list that was already longer than she'd expected today. I'll fix it, Stroud said Monday. Dr. Voss nodded once, satisfied, and went back into the suite. Okafor exhaled. He had been holding more tension in his body than he'd shown for the last 30 minutes, and the release of it was visible. He's going to be okay, he said, and it was directed at Dale Ferris, who received it with a nod that contained more relief than his face quite allowed. Olivia was already looking at the time. Her shift had ended 9 minutes ago. She had not noticed until now. Kessler found out about Gunner's medical event the same way he'd been finding out about everything, for the past 2 days after the fact, from second-hand reports, from the position of someone who no longer occupied the center of the information flow he'd thought he controlled. The assistant told him at 4:30. He sat in his office and read the summary, and then read the part where Olivia had identified the probable cause and prepared the clinical picture for the vet's arrival, and he did not write anything on his legal pad. At 4:55, Gordon Price sent him a calendar invitation for a meeting the following morning. 9 o'clock, Price's office. The attendees listed were Price, Kessler, and the hospital's HR director, a woman named Sylvia Moran, who had a reputation for thoroughness that her colleagues described as meticulous and her subjects described as something less comfortable. Kessler accepted the invitation. He sat for a while. He was not a man who was accustomed to sitting in the particular stillness of someone who can hear the structure of things changing. Around them he was a man who moved through institutions with the forward momentum of someone certain of his position within them. But the last two days had been instructive in the way that only direct confrontation with error can be. and the stillness he was sitting in now had the specific quality of a man who has run out of forward momentum and is becoming acquainted with what he actually has to stand on. Not much, it turned out. He opened his email at 5:03. There were 17 unread messages. The fourth was from Price, sent 40 minutes earlier, separate from the calendar invitation. The subject line was, "Follow up on K9 program staffing and clinical oversight." He read it again. Price had, in the careful and institutional language of an executive director who knew exactly what he was doing and wanted it documented that he knew, outlines a series of concerns about the K9 program's nursing liaison structure specifically, process by which nursing staff were assigned to the program, the criteria used for those assignments, and the degree to which those assignments reflected the clinical needs of the program versus other administrative considerations. The language never named Kessler specifically. It didn't need to. It also outlined, in the same careful language, the hospital's intention to restructure the K9 program's staffing framework in consultation with Commander Farrow's office, the K9 program director in D.C., and the nursing staff directly involved. The restructure would be coordinated through Stroud's office, not Kessler's. The final paragraph noted that the hospital's HR office would be conducting a review of nursing staff assignments in the rehabilitation wing over the past 6 months, with particular attention to role scope compliance, ensuring that nursing staff had been assigned duties consistent with their qualifications and job descriptions. Role scope compliance. Kessler was a physician administrator with 14 years of institutional experience. He understood exactly what that language meant. He understood it the way you understand the sound of structural failure, not as an abstraction, but as a physical fact, arriving in the body before the mind can rationalize it. He closed his laptop. He sat in his office until 5:30, when the building was quieter and the day shift staff had mostly gone, and then he picked up his coat and his bag and his still blank legal pad, and he walked out of his office and down the corridor and to the elevator, and he did not go past the rehabilitation wing on his way out. He went directly to the parking structure. He drove home. He did not call anyone. At 6:15, Olivia was in the staff lounge at the end of the rehabilitation corridor, a small room with a coffee machine that needed descaling and 2 plastic chairs and a window that looked out at the parking structure's concrete wall. She was sitting in one of the chairs with her jacket still on and her badge still clipped and an untouched cup of coffee on the table beside her, which told anyone with perceptive capacity that she'd made the coffee and then forgotten to drink it. Renee Solcis knocked on the open door and came in without waiting for an answer, which was the most Renee thing she had ever done in Olivia's presence, and therefore immediately made the room feel more manageable. She sat in the other plastic chair. She looked at the coffee. "That," she said. "It's cold." "Then drink it anyway." "You haven't eaten since this morning." "How do you know when I ate?" "Because you have the face," Renee said. "The face you had in the second deployment, when you kept doing double medical shifts because Rodriguez was down, and you kept forgetting to eat and you thought nobody noticed." She paused. "We all noticed." Olivia picked up the coffee. She drank some of it. "Cold. Where's Dale?" she asked, with Okafor. "They're talking about the dog's history for the program records. Dale wanted to make sure the documentation was complete. It's like him. Very like him." Renee looked at her. "Can I ask you something directly?" "You always ask things directly. Are you okay?" "Not clinically, not professionally actually okay." Olivia looked at the parking structure through the window. The light was down now, the late October evening having arrived at full dark in the way of that latitude and season, the concrete wall's surface broken only by the yellow of the structure's emergency lights. "I built something here," she said. "I built it specifically because it was contained, because it had edges. I knew where the job started and where it stopped. I knew what was expected, and I could exceed it without anyone knowing what exceeding it actually cost." She paused. "And now it's—" She looked for a word. "Open is not the same as broken," Renee said. "I know that. Do you, though?" Olivia looked at her. Renee held the look without flinching, which had always been one of her primary qualities, and also occasionally infuriating one. "I don't know what the next part looks like," Olivia said. "Program position Stroud mentioned. The disclosure. All of it." She turned the cold coffee cup in her hands. "Spent 6 years making this quiet, and now in 4 days it's—" She stopped. "Not quiet," Renee said, "not quiet." Renee was quiet herself for a moment. Then she said, "You know what I remember about you, in the element? You never acted like the hard thing was the worst thing. You just went toward it. You hated the paperwork, and you hated the bureaucracy, and you hated that they never gave us enough of anything. But when something actually required everything you had, you—" She pressed her lips together. "You stopped being tired." Olivia looked at her. You're doing it right now, Renee said. Can see it. You've been doing it all day. You ran toward the code blue. You sat on the floor with Gunnar. You identified the medication cause. You told Kessler the truth about himself. She paused. That's not a person who built something quiet because she wanted to be smaller. That's a person who was being careful about where she spent herself. The lounge was quiet. The coffee machine made a distant procedural sound. Program, Olivia said. The one Stroud mentioned. The medical integration specialist role. What about it? It would mean being visible. In a way that I haven't been. Yes, Renee said simply. It would mean the history is part of the job instead of separate from it. Yes, Olivia turned the cup again. Then she set it down. I need to think about it. That's fine, Renee said. At the time. She stood. But Olivia, those 3 dogs, they didn't come to this program because they found a soft landing. They came because they needed someone who understood what they carried. And they found you. In a building full of people. She moved to the door. It's not coincidence. That's just what you are. She left, and Olivia sat in the small room with the cold coffee and the parking structure's yellow light, and the sun of the hospital, continuing its necessary work around her. She thought about Kessler's expression in the gym, after she'd told him to look at the pattern. Particular quality of a man understanding that his authority had been a surface, not a substance, and that surfaces, when someone finally touches them, reveal what they are. She thought about Ruth Pullman's shoulder, and the 4-second orientation gap, and the decision not to attempt reduction. She thought about Gunnar on the floor, his eyes finding her with the same absolute focus they'd found her with, in rooms that had been much less safe than an assessment suite. She thought about the 9 o'clock meeting in Price's office, the HR director, the role scope compliance review, what that meant for Kessler, and what it meant for the 5 other nurses in the rehabilitation wing who had been given tasks below their scope and had accepted them, in the way people accept things when the alternative seems more costly than the accommodation. Picked up her phone. She found Stroud's number. She typed, I'd like to discuss the medical integration specialist position. Schedule is open Thursday morning. She sent it. She sat for 30 more seconds. Then she stood, threw away the cold coffee, and went back to the floor to make sure the evening handoff documentation was complete, because the patients were there and the work was there. Those 2 things had always, every life she'd lived, been the most reliable place to put her feet. Thursday morning did not arrive the way any of them expected. At 8:47, 13 minutes before Price's meeting with Kessler, and the HR director Sylvia Moran arrived in Price's office with a manila folder and a measured expression and placed the folder on the desk. She had been conducting the preliminary scope compliance review since the previous afternoon, which was faster than anyone had expected, but Moran was someone for whom thoroughness and speed were not opposites. How many? Price asked. 7 documented instances in the last 4 months where nursing staff in the rehabilitation wing were assigned duties outside their role scope, she said. 3 of those involved Nurse Marsh specifically. 4 involved 2 other nurses, Priya Anand and a nurse named Torres, who transferred out last month. Torres transferred out because of workload, Price said. It was not quite a question. Torres's exit interview cited excessive non-clinical assignments as the primary factor, Moran said. She was polite about it, but it's documented. She paused. There are also 3 instances where Nurse Marsh was redirected from her assigned patients to perform tasks for which orderlies or administrative staff were already rostered and available. Price looked at the folder. He looked at the time. Kessler arrives in 13 minutes. I know, Moranza said. Is this the full picture? It's the preliminary picture, she said. I'd like 2 more days to complete the review before we characterize it formally. She paused again, the pause of someone with one more thing to add. I also want you to know that 2 of the nursing staff I spoke with yesterday informally said they'd been aware of the pattern with Nurse Marsh's assignments. They didn't report it because, she chose her next words carefully, because they didn't think it would be received well. The room was quiet. Price said, get me the full review by end of day Friday. Moran picked up her folder. I'll have it to you by Thursday afternoon, she said, with the particular satisfaction of someone who sets deadlines and treats them as minimum thresholds. She left. Price looked at the time again. He looked at his phone. He had 3 unread messages, one from Commander Farrow's office, confirming the formal interest of the Navy K9 personnel program in Hargrove's site as a model integration facility, one from the program director in D.C., requesting a call for the following week, and one from Stroud, sent at 6:51 in the morning, which read, Olivia Marsh has agreed to discuss the medical integration specialist role. Person. I want to move on this before someone else figures that out. He read all 3. He set the phone down. He arranged the folders on his desk with the systematic calm of someone who has understood the day's structure and is preparing to work through it. At 9 o'clock exactly, his assistant opened the door and said, "Doctor, Kessler is here." "Send him in," Price said. Kessler walked in looking the way he'd looked for 2 days, slightly compressed, slightly off his axis, the posture of a man who had been moving on momentum for years and was now navigating without it. He sat in the chair across from Price's desk. He glanced at the manila folders. He looked at Moran, who had returned and was seated to Price's left with her own folders, and a pen in the expression of a professional who had seen this particular type of meeting several times and had developed a systematic approach to it. "Price," said Raymond, "thank you for coming." "Of course," Kessler said. "I want to be direct with you about why we're here," Price said. "It'll go faster that way, and I think you already have a sense of the terrain." Kessler said nothing. "The scope compliance review has identified a pattern of irregular task assignments in your wing," Price said. "Several instances where nursing staff, including Nurse Marsh and others, were assigned duties below their clinical scope or outside their role definition. We're going to discuss those findings, and we're going to discuss what oversight changes are needed going forward." He paused. "I also want to discuss the K9 program situations, specifically not as an isolated incident, but as the most visible expression of a pattern that appears to be systemic." Kessler's jaw tightened. "The K9 situation was a program integration decision, Raymond," Price said, and the quiet in his voice was more effective than volume would have been. "I've read the timeline. I've spoken to Okafor. I've reviewed the morning's protocol for the K9 assessment." He put his hands flat on the desk. "I need you to be honest with me in this room, because we have a lot of work to do here, and honesty is going to be the fastest way through it." Kessler looked at Moran's folder. He looked at Price. He was a man who had spent 14 years in institutions understanding where the weight was, where the authority resided, where the line was between the negotiable and the non-negotiable. He was reading all of those things right now in this room and arriving at an accurate assessment for the first time in several days. "What do you need from me?" he said. "To start," Price said, "I'd like a truthful account of the decision to assign Nurse Marsh to the K9 liaison role and to place her in the assessment suite without prior notification of the morning's protocol." The room waited. And Kessler, who was not a man without intelligence, who was not a man without the capacity for honesty, when honesty became the only remaining structural option, said, "I assigned her because I thought she'd be easy to manage and the role would be beneath her." He said it with the flat, exhausted directness of someone who has stopped performing. "And I put her in the suite because I expected her to struggle with it. I thought it would demonstrate that her competence had limits." He paused. "I was wrong. About all of it." The manila folder sat on Price's desk between them, containing its 7 documented instances and its 2 pages of exit interview notes and its preliminary findings that were already, in their careful institutional language, building the architecture of what came next. Outside Price's office, the hospital moved through its morning. 3 floors below, in the rehabilitation wing, Olivia Marsh was checking Dennis Harlan's wound care and asking him what his pain number was and listening to the whole answer. At the end of the corridor, in the assessment suite, Gunnar was on his feet, still careful, still slower than his normal range, but on his feet, and Dusk was at the window and Atlas was at the door, and all 3 of them were pointing in the direction of the nursing station, the way they'd been pointing since morning, waiting for the sound of a particular set of footsteps they'd been tracking since the first day they arrived here, and finally understood where they were. And in Price's office, Kessler sat in the chair and the folder sat on the desk, and the HR director's pen was moving, and the particular structure of things that had existed in the rehabilitation wing of Hargrove Veterans Medical Center for the months before Olivia Marsh arrived was in the methodical and irrevocable process of being unmade, one documented instance at a time, with the same slow grinding precision that accountability always used when it finally arrived and found the room it had been looking for. But what nobody in the building knew yet, not Price, not Stroud, not Okafor, not even Renee and Dale, who were in the hospital cafeteria with cold eggs, and a plan to drive back to their respective lives by noon, was that Commander Farrow had placed a call at 8:15 that morning to a specific office in the Navy's Medical Personnel Division. And that call had prompted a second call, and the second call had reached an office that dealt with a very specific category of veteran healthcare worker, the ones whose service records contained the kind of documented actions that existed in a category, the military, reserved for people who had, under conditions that most people couldn't imagine, done something that went beyond what the job required. Paperwork from that second call was already in transit. It would arrive at Hargrove's administrative office by the end of business Thursday. And when Olivia Marsh's name appeared at the top of that document, not as a subject of review, not as a person whose history was being examined, but in the specific field reserved for the recipient of a formal military recognition that her own reticence had delayed for 6 years the shape of what she was, in this building and beyond it, would become something that nobody in the rehabilitation wing had the language to diminish anymore. Paperwork arrived at 3:42 on Thursday afternoon, carried by a courier who signed in at the front desk with the practiced efficiency of someone who did this regularly and understood that the value of what he carried had nothing to do with the weight of it. The envelope was plain, government issue, with a return address that the front desk administrator didn't immediately recognize, but that Price's assistant did, because she had 22 years of institutional memory, and certain return addresses stayed with you once you'd seen them. She brought it directly to Price without opening it, which was protocol, and Price opened it at his desk at 3:51, after his last meeting of the day had cleared and the office was quiet. He read the cover letter. He read the attached document. He read the cover letter again, because the first read had produced the specific experience of information that exceeds the container you've prepared for it. He called Stroud at 4:03. Stroud read the document at 4:19, standing in her own office with her coat still on, because she'd just come back from a meeting in the main building and hadn't yet taken it off, and she stood there in her coat and read it twice and then set it on her desk and looked at the wall for a moment and then picked up her phone. She did not call Olivia directly. She called Okafor. "Where is she?" Stroud asked, finishing her shift. "Room 11, she's doing a discharge summary. When she's done, bring her to my office." A pause. "Don't tell her why. I want her to read it herself." Okafor was quiet for a second. "Is it good news?" "It's the right news," Stroud said. "It was better." Olivia was not in room 11 when Okafor went looking. She was in the assessment suite, which was where she'd taken to going in the last 20 minutes of her shift when the floor was stable, and the handoff was mostly done not as a clinical obligation, just as the particular kind of presence that didn't require explanation. Gunnar was on his feet again, moving more easily than the day before, the metabolic cascade from the medication reaction retreating as the compound cleared his system. Dr. Voss had done a morning check and called the trajectory positive. Gunnar had eaten his full meal. He was at the window when Okafor opened the suite door. He registered the intrusion and looked at Olivia, and she said something quiet to him, and he went back to the window, which Okafor had learned in 4 days was the closest thing to a social endorsement. Those 3 animals offered anyone they didn't already know. "Stroud wants you," he said. Olivia finished writing the notation she was making in her observation log. The K9 program's documentation protocol had already been revised. One of the items Stroud had moved on immediately and closed the log. Why? She didn't specify. She looked at him. He kept his face neutral with the effort of someone who has been asked to maintain a surprise and finds surprises mildly uncomfortable as an institutional concept. She let it go. She told Gunnar she'd be back, and she meant it, which was the kind of thing that would have seemed strange to say 4 days ago and now seemed like the most natural sentence in the world. She walked out of the suite and down the corridor and up to Stroud's office, which occupied a corner of the rehabilitation wing's administrative section, with 2 windows and a desk that was never as organized as Stroud intended it to be. Stroud was standing when she arrived, not behind the desk but beside it, which was unusual. She handed Olivia the document without preamble, because preamble was not something Barbara Stroud deployed when the thing itself was sufficient. Olivia read the cover letter. She was still. She read the attached document. Stillness changed quality, became the stillness of a person who is not feeling, but who is feeling something large enough that the body's first response is to go quiet, the way the air goes quiet before weather. The document was a formal notification of a military commendation that had been submitted 6 years ago, administrators ago, and had moved through the administrative pipeline of a branch of the armed forces with the particular slowness of things that involve classified operational context and required multiple levels of review before they could be made legible to civilian institutions. Commendation was for actions during a specific incident, the incident Olivia had described in Price's conference room as the 6 hours on the floor of an unsecured position, keeping Gunnar alive, and it had been submitted by the senior handler of her unit, a man named Dale Ferris, whose name appeared on the submission form in the same handwriting that had written detailed accounts of that specific night. Commendation was not only for the K9 work, that had been the trigger for the submission. The full text covered a broader scope of actions across the operational period field, medical decisions made under fire, care sustained in conditions that the reviewing officers had characterized with language that was precise and military and devoid of sentimentality, and was, because of that precision, more powerful than any elaboration would have been. At the bottom of the document, in the field reserved for classification of the commendation's type, was a category that Olivia had not expected. She had expected an achievement citation. What she was looking at was a designation she'd last seen applied to someone else, years before, in a ceremony she'd attended, and that had made her understand for the first time what the phrase above and beyond actually cost. Stood there for a long time. Stroud did not rush her. Finally, Olivia said, "Dale submitted this." 6 years ago, Stroud said. The delay was classification review. The incident required full declassification of the operational details before the commendation could be shared with a civilian institution. She paused. Commander Farrow's call on Wednesday morning accelerated the final clearance. Apparently it had been sitting in a review queue. 6 years, Olivia said, and she said it the way you say something that contains too many things to name individually. He submitted it the week after you separated, Stroud said, according to the cover letter. Olivia set the document on the desk. Her hands were steady. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was working to keep it composed, and was mostly succeeding the slight tightening at the corners of her eyes. The deliberate and conscious process of containment. "What does this mean for the hospital?" she asked, because she was practical at her core, even now, even with this. "It means," Stroud said, "that I have formal documentation of your service record and commendation that I can use to support the medical integration specialist position in my program funding application. The Navy's interest in Hargrove as a model site becomes considerably more concrete when the liaison candidate has this in her file." She paused. "It also means that when the program expansion is announced, the veteran rehabilitation integration, the expanded K9 therapy roster, your name and your background will be part of that announcement." Permission. Olivia was quiet. "Call," Stroud said. "Not mine. Not Price's. Commander Farrow's yours." The office was quiet. Outside Stroud's windows, the October light had gone the color of old brass. The sun dropping behind the western hills, the parking structure casting a long shadow across the courtyard. Olivia looked at it and thought about the stairwell, 3 days ago, pressing her palm against her shoulder. Private accounting. The question of whether she had more time. She hadn't had more time. She'd been right about that. But Renee had also been right. Open was not the same as broken. "Yes," she said, "with my permission." Stroud nodded once. It was a nod that contained a lot. The results of Sylvia Moran's full-scope compliance review were delivered to Price at 4:47 Thursday afternoon, 2 hours ahead of her stated deadline, because Moran operated on the principle that the stated deadline was the latest acceptable time, not the target. The review was 18 pages. It documented 11 instances of non-scope assignments across the rehabilitation wing over a 5-month period. It documented 3 nurses who had been redirected from patient care to administrative and maintenance tasks, for which other staff were available and rostered. It documented the exit interview of the nurse named Torres, who had listed excessive non-clinical workload as her primary reason for transfer. It also, in its final section, documented something that the scope review had surfaced as a secondary finding. Pattern in which Kessler's assignment decisions correlated specifically with nurses who did not verbally push back against task redirection, a pattern that the review characterized as systematic exploitation of professional deference, a phrase that was institutional and precise, and carried the specific weight of language that had been chosen very carefully. Price read the review Thursday evening. He read it the way you read something when you are building a decision, not searching for permission, but assembling the materials the decision requires. He met with Kessler Friday morning. The HR director was present. The meeting lasted 40 minutes. Kessler was moved from his role as Rehabilitation Wing Director to a non-supervisory clinical advisory position, a restructure that was framed in the institutional language of realignment, but that everyone in the building understood for what it was: the removal of authority from a person who had demonstrated, over a documented period, that he was not using it in the interest of the staff he supervised. Kessler did not contest it. He had read the review. He had enough institutional experience to understand that the review was not the worst version of what could have happened, and that contesting it would produce the worst version. He signed the realignment paperwork on Friday afternoon and cleared his office over the weekend. And on Monday morning he arrived at his new desk in the clinical advisory suite on the 3rd floor and sat down and began the particular and uncomfortable work of a person who has been given a second chance they know they needed and are not entirely sure they deserved. There was a version of that story where his departure was clean and public and satisfying in the way of institutional theater. But the real version was quieter than that, more complicated, more human. He was not an evil man. He was a man who had treated certain kinds of people as though they were less substantial than they were, and who had done it long enough that it had become invisible to him. The review had made it visible again. What he did with that visibility was, from this point forward, his problem to manage. Staff of the rehabilitation wing waited to see. They were, most of them, willing to watch. A few of them were not, which was also their right, and the shape of trust is that it does not reassemble at the same speed it fractures. Priya Anand, for her part, did something that took more courage than the small size of it suggested. She went to Olivia on Friday afternoon and said plainly, "I'm sorry. Not just for the video, for all of it. For the things I said and laughed at in the first week." She didn't offer justifications. She had decided that justifications were the things she owed least in this particular situation. Olivia looked at her. "I know," she said. "Is that it? What else do you want me to say?" Priya almost smiled. "I don't know. Something more." "Okay," Olivia said. "You're a good nurse. You saw things you should have said something about, and you didn't, and that's something to carry. Carry it productively." She paused. "Also, your potassium monitoring on the patient in room 8 is excellent. I've been watching you work this week." Priya blinked. "I meant that as a compliment," Olivia said. "I know," Priya said. "Just wasn't what I expected. Most true things aren't." Priya went back to the nursing station and sat down and thought about that for the rest of her shift with the quality of attention. That means a thing has landed somewhere real. On Monday of the following week, Stroud called a staff meeting. Not a crisis meeting, a program meeting. The standing monthly gathering of the K9 program's full team, which now included Olivia in her new formal role as medical integration specialist, effective the previous Friday. The role came with a revised job description, a salary adjustment, and, more practically, a level of institutional standing that meant her clinical decisions regarding the K9 unit moved through the system the way clinical decisions were supposed to move, with authority, without detour. Dale Ferris and Renee Solis had gone back to their respective lives on Thursday, after staying 2 days longer than they'd planned. Before Dale left, he spent an hour in the assessment suite with Gunnar, and Olivia did not interrupt it or observe it, because some things did not need an audience. Renee left her phone number written on a piece of actual paper, handed to Olivia in the staff lounge, which was the most analog gesture Renee had made in probably a decade, and which communicated something that digital contact could not. The Monday meeting covered the program's expanded mandate. Stroud presented the framework in her characteristic style: direct, dense with information, impatient with both vagueness and excessive optimism. The K9 therapy program would double its active roster over the following 6 months. Atlas and Dusk would be moved to active therapy status, which meant they would begin working with veteran patients in structured sessions. The medical oversight protocol would be Olivia's, built from the documentation standards she'd established in the first week and revised after Gunnar's event. There was new funding. There were new staff lines. There was, for the first time in the program's 3-year existence, an institutional budget line for veterinary integration that did not require Stroud to argue for it quarterly. Commander Farrow's office had confirmed Hargrove as a model site. The announcement would go to the hospital's external communications on Wednesday. Lord Riley, 3 floors up in room 14, heard about it through his daughter, who had seen the hospital's internal newsletter, and he told his PT during Thursday's session, "I told you she was something." PT, who had been at Hargrove for 2 years and had a healthy skepticism of staff mythology, said, "You didn't know anything about her service record when you said that." "No," Riley said, "but I knew she was something." He worked his left arm through the range of motion sequence, slow and grinding and incrementally better than the week before. Thing about people. You can usually tell. You just have to pay attention. 3 weeks after the morning in the assessment suite, Olivia was running a K9 therapy session with a 31-year-old veteran named Patrick Seo, who had been at Hargrove for 6 weeks, following a traumatic brain injury sustained in a training accident. He was in the difficult middle stage of TBI recovery, the stage where the initial crisis has passed and the long, uncertain work of neural repair and psychological adaptation has begun, and the work is slow enough to feel like no movement at all, even when it is measurably movement. He sat on the floor of the assessment suite, now formally the integration therapy suite, with new signage and new equipment with Atlas on his left, and said almost nothing for the first 15 minutes. This was normal. This was how it went in the early sessions. Olivia sat across the room with her observation log and wrote what she saw, which was a young man learning, in the presence of an animal that had its own history of recovery. Stillness was not the same as stagnation. Eventually Patrick said, "Does he know I'm messed up?" "Yes," Olivia said. Patrick looked at Atlas. Atlas looked back with the evaluating, thorough attention that was simply his nature. Does it bother him? No, she said. Patrick was quiet for another minute. How do you know? Because he's still here. He thought about that. His right hand was on Atlas's back, and the pressure of it was something Patrick had not fully registered, happening the incremental, unconscious decision to reach out. In TBI recovery was sometimes the entire arc of a session and was never small. Been through stuff, Patrick said. It was not a question. Yes. Bad stuff? The kind you come back from, Olivia said. But you come back different. For a long time. Yeah, he said quietly. In her observation log, Olivia wrote 3 lines. Clinical notation factual, using the standardized language of the protocol she'd built. The 3 lines contained the whole weight of the session, which was this. A young man who had been inside his own damage for 6 weeks had, for 15 minutes, been outside it. Not because anyone had told him to be, not because of medication or directive or therapeutic instruction, but because an animal with its own damage had sat beside him without judgment and waited. That was the mechanism. That was what the program was. She had been trying to explain it to Price the week before, in one of the funding conversations, and she had struggled with the language of institutional documentation, which wanted outcomes and metrics and measurable improvement indicators, all of which were real and which she could provide. Core of it was harder to put in a report that certain kinds of healing required, as their primary condition, the presence of something that did not need you to be fixed. That recovery, for people who had carried the kind of weight these patients had carried, often began not with treatment, but with the experience of being accepted at their current weight by something that understood weight. She'd finally told Price, the data will support it. Give me 6 months and I'll show you the numbers. But the reason it works is not a number. Price had looked at her over his desk, with the expression of a man deciding how much institutional poetry to tolerate, and then he'd said, 6 months, and signed the funding form. It was not a perfect outcome. It never was. The scope compliance review's findings were available to staff in a summary form, which meant that the conversation about what had been happening in the rehabilitation wing was not private. It was not comfortable. It produced, in the nursing staff, the particular unease of people recognizing that something had been wrong in their environment, and they had been part of the environment while it was wrong, which was different from complicity, but not entirely separate from it, and that distinction required each person to do their own accounting. Some of them did the accounting well. Some of them did it badly, which is how most accountings go. Donna Reyes, who had said what she said about Olivia in the first week, and had never been corrected for it, came and said so, directly found Olivia in the corridor one afternoon and said, I owe you one. It was brief and imprecise and clearly cost her something, which was perhaps the most honest version of an apology that Donna Reyes had available. You don't owe me anything, Olivia said, but pay attention to how you talk about the new people when they come in. Donna nodded. She walked away. She thought about it more than she showed, which was also, for Donna, more honesty than most people got. Gunner's first active therapy session was on a Thursday 6 weeks after his acute episode. Dr. Voss had cleared him. His new anti-inflammatory protocol different compound, properly screened, had been stable for a month. He moved well. The hip on his left side was stiffer than it had been at his peak, and he tired slightly faster than Atlas or Dusk. But within the session parameters that Olivia had built into the protocol, he was functional and willing and, in the specific way of a working dog given purposeful activity after a period of limitation, considerably happier. His patient that Thursday was a 65-year-old veteran named Carol Whitman, who had been in the program for 2 weeks and who had not, in those 2 weeks, been willing to engage with any of the therapy dogs. She sat in the corner of the suite and answered questions and followed instructions and maintained the careful, defended composure of someone who had been managing grief for a long time and had gotten very good at looking like management was enough. Gunner walked into the suite, registered the room, looked at Olivia the checking-in look, the one she recognized as his version of, "What do you need?" and then walked, without instruction, to the corner where Carol Whitman was sitting and lay down directly in front of her feet. He did not look up at her. He did not perform engagement. He lay there with the complete, settled patience of an animal that understood waiting. Carol Whitman looked at him for 40 seconds. Then she put her hand on his head. She did not cry. She was not the kind of person who cried in rooms where other people could see it. Something in her face changed the release of something that had been held at cost for a long time, surfacing briefly and then resettling, changed by the surfacing. Olivia wrote in her log. Across the room, Bremer, who had been with the program for 6 months and who had grown in those 6 months from uncertain to competent in ways that the program's chaos had accelerated, watched and said nothing. She was learning that sometimes nothing was the correct response. For the session, walking the corridor back toward the nursing station, Bremer said to Olivia, "How did he know to go to her?" "He read the room," Olivia said. "But how?" "The same way you learn to read anything," Olivia said. "Pay attention long enough and you start to see what's actually there instead of what you expect to be there." Bremer thought about that. "Did someone teach you that?" Olivia was quiet for a moment. "The hard way," she said, "which is mostly how it works." On the day that the formal commendation ceremony was held quiet, institutional, in Price's conference room, attended by Price and Stroud and Okafor and Commander Farrow and, via video from a spare room in a facility 4 states away, Dale Ferris, whose jaw scar was visible even in the compressed rectangle of the video call. Olivia wore her scrubs because she had therapy sessions afterward, and she was not going to reschedule them. This was noted by everyone present and remarked on by no one, because it was entirely in character and entirely right. Commander Farrow read the commendation text. The language was military and formal and was also, stripped of its formal dressing, the account of a woman who had stayed in an unsecured position for 6 hours and kept a living thing alive through the application of whatever she had available, which had turned out to be more than the position required and less than she would have preferred. She had been 26 years old. She had been doing this for 3 years already by then. When Farrow finished reading, the room was the specific quiet of people who have heard something that has reset their understanding of the scale of things. Price looked at Olivia. "I owe you an apology," he said. Blinked. "For what specifically?" "For the weeks before I understood the situation. For the institutional failure that allowed your assignment to be used as a tool for someone else's agenda. That happened in my hospital." He paused. "It shouldn't have." "No," she agreed. "It shouldn't have. I'm sorry it did." She looked at him with the directness that was by now something every person in the room had experienced, and none of them had fully gotten used to. "The review was thorough," she said. "The response was appropriate. What you do now with the new protocols, with the staff oversight structure, that's what matters." She paused. "People make mistakes in institutions. The question was what the institution does when it finds them." Price was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I want to offer you something more than the medical integration role. You don't need to. Hear me out." He straightened slightly in the way of a man who has made a decision and is presenting it, not requesting feedback. "I want to establish a formal patient advocacy position within the rehabilitation wing. Non-supervisory, clinical track, reporting directly to program leadership, not to the wing director. Purpose is to ensure that staff are assigned within their scope, that clinical knowledge is being applied at the level it exists, and that the pattern we saw does not develop again." He looked at her. "I want you to help design the role. Not necessarily fill it, though that's an option, but design it. Because you understand better than most what the absence of it costs." The room was quiet. Olivia looked at the conference table, then at the window, then at Dale's pixelated image in the video rectangle. Dale was looking at her with the expression of a man who has been waiting for a very specific thing and is watching it happen. "Design it," she said. "On one condition." Price raised an eyebrow. "The nurses who were affected by the previous structure Anand, Torres, if she's willing to come back. Others in the review, they get an explicit acknowledgement from administration that the scope violations were institutional failures, not personal ones. In writing. In their personnel files." Price looked at Moran, who was seated at the end of the table. Moran said, "That's already drafted." Olivia looked at her. "I anticipated the request," Moran said, with the serene efficiency of someone who had anticipated many requests across a long career and had found it less complicated than waiting to be asked. It needed to happen regardless. A pause, then Olivia said, "Okay." She said it plainly, with the weight of someone who has been carrying something for a long time and is putting it down without ceremony, because ceremony would have been excessive, and this moment already real, already complete, did not need the addition of theater. Dale, from his video rectangle, said, "I'm proud of you." His voice was rough the way voices get rough when people are feeling something they normally don't allow public access to. "You trained me to be stubborn," she said. "I trained you to be competent," he said. Stubborn part was already there. Farrow, who had the professional composure of someone who had attended many ceremonies and had long since calibrated her emotional responses accordingly, permitted herself a small smile. She did not remark on it. She gathered her documents. She said, "Nurse Marsh, on behalf of the branch, thank you for your service and for the quality of the work you're doing here. Thank you for the paperwork moving," Olivia said, which made Okafor exhale a short, genuine laugh. The thing about Olivia Marsh, the thing that the hospital came to understand gradually, over the weeks that followed, The way you come to understand anything that is shown to you over time, rather than explained, was that she was not a story about hidden greatness revealed. She was not a story about a secret waiting to be uncovered. She was a story about what happens when you build a structure around the wrong assumptions. When you look at a person who does not perform their competence, and you read that absence of performance as absence of competence. When you assign tasks based on what you believe someone will accept rather than what they are qualified for. When the institutional culture rewards compliance over contribution, and nobody asks why the quietest people are always the ones carrying the most weight. That story happens every day in every institution in the world. Most of the time, the person in the quiet role does not have a prior military service record, and 3 retired K9s to provide a visible counter-argument. Most of the time, the mechanism of underestimation is never exposed, and the pattern continues, and the cost is borne by the person who is already bearing it without complaint. Olivia's situation was particular, but the failure that produced it was not. Dennis Harlan was discharged in November. His knee recovered to the degree that a man in his early 40s, with decades of military wear in his joints, could hope for, which was functional and manageable and not what it once was, which he had made his peace with in the particular way that practical people make peace with things, by focusing on what the functional and manageable version could still do. He shook Olivia's hand at discharge. "You asked me the real question," he said. "Stay. You asked what the number actually was, not what I wanted you to hear." "It's a better question," she said. "Most people don't ask it. Most people don't want to deal with the real answer." He nodded. "You're going to be something in this place," he said. Not a prediction, an observation, from someone who had been watching. Howard Riley was discharged 2 weeks later, his left arm at 60% of its pre-stroke function and climbing, his disposition not significantly improved, but his progress significant enough that the occupational therapist had revised his long projection upward. He did not give a speech at discharge. He was not a speech-giving man. He looked at Olivia in the doorway of his room. Bags packed, Sandra waiting in the corridor with the car keys, and the complicated love of a daughter who had sat in a hospital chair twice a week for 7 weeks. And he said, "You don't back down." "No," she said. "Good," he said. "Don't start." He walked past her into the corridor, his left arm held slightly away from his body the way it would always be held now, at the angle his nervous system had rebuilt for it, which was not the original angle, but was real and functional, and his. Sandra smiled at Olivia over his shoulder. Olivia nodded back. She stood in the doorway of the empty room for a moment after they left. The bed was already stripped, the monitor was off. The room had the clean, waiting quality of a space that has held something important and is now preparing to hold the next thing. She went back to work. In the 6th week of the program expansion, Gunnar, Atlas, and Dusk were all in active therapy rotation. The schedule Olivia had built distributed their sessions, carefully accounting for age, energy, recovery time, and the specific behavioral demands of different patient profiles. Gunnar worked best with patients in later stages of recovery, where the relationship could develop over multiple sessions, and his particular quality of settled patients could do its work across time. Atlas was better with acute presentations, the first contact sessions, where a patient was still deciding whether to engage at all, his evaluating directness somehow more honest than the performance of comfort. Dusk worked with everyone, adapting in the way of the oldest and most experienced, reading each session on its own terms, never assuming she knew what it needed before she had assessed it. On a Tuesday morning in late November, the first snow of the season came down over Dunmore, light and directionless, the flakes moving sideways as much as down in the wind that came off the hills. Olivia was at the nursing station before her shift formally began, reviewing the day's session schedule, when she heard the sound in the corridor that she had come to recognize as the specific, purposeful approach of 3 large dogs being walked to their morning station. Brimmer came first, then Okafor, then the dogs Gunnar, measured and deliberate, Atlas ahead by half a step as always. Dusk at the rear with her slight hip list, her dark eyes reading the floor ahead. They went past the nursing station. Then Gunnar stopped. He turned and looked at Olivia across the counter. His tail moved not the frantic wagging of a dog who has been denied attention, but the slow, considered movement of an animal who is making a clear statement. His eyes were on her face with the complete, focused attention that she had known for 6 years and had not lost in a decade of military service, and a year of neglect, and 8 months of a new facility, and 4 days of revelation, and 6 weeks of reconstruction. "Good morning," she said. His tail moved again. Atlas turned his head. Dusk raised hers. Okafor watched from the corridor and said nothing, because there was nothing to say that the moment wasn't already saying, and he had learned, in the company of these 3 animals, The best thing you could do with a moment like this was stay out of its way. Olivia came around the nursing station, crouched down, her left shoulder aching with the familiar October cold that would follow her for the rest of her life as the body's private notation of an old bill paid in full, and she put her hand on Gunner's head, stayed absolutely still under it, the way he had stayed still in the worst hours of both their lives, in the dark, in the noise, in the terrible narrowed-down specificity of a crisis, when the only available fact was that she was there, and she was not leaving. "We've got work to do," she told him. He looked at her, stood. They went to work. The hospital moved around them the way hospitals move, necessary, and continuous and full of the particular human mix of competence and failure, and recovery and loss, all of it running on the labor of people who chose to show up and do the difficult thing every day, some of them recognized for it, and some of them not. And the distance between those two groups was sometimes circumstance, and sometimes injustice, and usually some combination of both that nobody had cleanly solved. What Olivia Marsh had learned in the field and in the facility, in the 6 years of rebuilding, and the 4 days of exposure, and the 6 weeks of reconstruction was this: quiet you build around yourself to stay safe will eventually become a room too small to live in. Not because quiet is wrong, but because the things you carry do not diminish in the dark. They wait. They are patient in the way of important things, the way Dusk was patient, the way Gunner found her across a room he had never been in and simply stood. You can carry your history as a burden, which is heavy and gets heavier. Or you can carry it as a tool, which has weight too, but weight with a purpose. Weight that does something when you put it down in the right place. She had spent 6 years learning the difference. She spent the next ones living it. The first snow of the season came down over Dunmore, Pennsylvania, moving sideways in the wind off the hills, covering the parking structure and the courtyard and the stripped trees of the hospital perimeter, making the world briefly and impartially white. And inside Hargrove Veterans Medical Center, in a suite at the end of the rehabilitation corridor, a woman and 3 dogs began a session with a young man who had not yet learned that the distance between where he was and where he might still get to was crossable, and they crossed it with him, one Tuesday morning at a time, for as long as it took. That was the work. That was enough.